Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity gets cozy and the mind drifts easily through wonder. Tonight we're going to sink beneath the surface of something vast, older than mountains and deeper than memory itself, the ocean. But not the ocean as you know it from the shorelines of today, not the one framed by sunbathers, buoys or fishing boats. I'm talking about the ocean that existed when giants ruled it, when the continents were strangers and the water was the only kingdom that mattered. This is the story of what the ocean was like during the age of giants, when life in the deep was both magnificent and merciless. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're near the coast, maybe miles from the nearest drop of salt water. Either way, the ocean finds its way to you. In the air you breathe, the rain that falls, the faint scent of salt that sometimes lingers in the wind. If this gentle exploration helps you unwind or brings a bit of calm curiosity to your night, it would mean a lot if you left a like or subscribed. It helps this small current of wonder flow a little further. Now, if you're settled, let's take a slow breath together. Imagine the sound of waves rolling in, the weightless silence that exists just below the surface, and that endless blue stretching farther than sight. Because the ocean has been here almost since the beginning. It's the oldest witness to Earth's history, patient and enduring, shifting shape while everything else rises and falls. The ocean is not just water, it's the planet's memory. And if we could listen closely enough, we might still hear the echoes of the great creatures that once called it home. Before any giant ever swam through it, before anything with eyes could even see, there was heat, pressure, and chaos. 4.5 billion years ago, Earth was not a blue marble. It was a world of molten rock and boiling storms. Asteroids fell like rain. The air was thick with vaporized minerals. The idea of an ocean was at that time impossible. But slowly, through cooling, through the long patience of chemistry, water began to appear. At first it escaped from inside the planet itself, steam from volcanic eruptions that condensed and fell back down. Over millions of years the downpour never stopped. Imagine rain lasting for eons, hissing as it hit the burning ground, turning the surface to mud, then to pools, then to an endless flood. The first ocean wasn't gentle blue. It was dark, mineral-rich, and still warm from the planet's fever. Yet in that hostile water, something remarkable began. If you could travel back to that time, you wouldn't see beaches or coral reefs. You'd find yourself under a copper sky, staring at waves tinted red by iron particles. The ocean would smell of metal and sulphur. Lightning would flash over the horizon, igniting temporary brightness across the storming surface. And deep below, hidden from the chaos above, chemistry was quietly building something new. Molecules met, split, and rejoined in endless combinations until, one day, they didn't just react, they began to replicate. Somewhere in that restless sea, life stirred for the very first time. That first spark wasn't dramatic. It didn't swim or move or think, it simply existed. A self-replicating molecule inside a droplet of water. But that humble beginning was enough to change everything. Over time, those molecules gave rise to cells, and those cells found comfort in the ocean's embrace. The water protected them from the sun's harsh radiation, fed them with dissolved minerals, and gave them time, lots of it. Billions of years of quiet, unseen evolution. When we think of the ocean today, we imagine whales breaching or coral gardens glowing with colour, but for most of Earth's history, it was a microscopic world. The sea was filled with invisible drifters, cyanobacteria, the pioneers of photosynthesis. They turned sunlight into energy and, in doing so, filled the ocean with oxygen. They were tiny, but they were powerful. They changed the chemistry of the entire planet. If the ocean was Earth's womb, these were its first heartbeat. As oxygen accumulated, the seas began to clear. Iron that once stained the water red fell to the seafloor, forming rust-coloured bands that still exist in rocks today. Slowly, the world shifted from a haze of toxic gases to an atmosphere that could someday support complex life. And for the first time, light began to reach the depths. Imagine sunlight filtering through new blue water after billions of years of darkness. A silent unveiling of colour, a shift from alien to almost familiar. At this stage, life was still small, but no longer simple. Single cells formed colonies, and colonies began to specialise. It took nearly 3 billion years for the ocean to go from chemical soup to thriving ecosystems. But when it did, the change was explosive. The Cambrian seas, often called the cradle of animal life, were filled with creatures that look strange to us now, but were the first of their kind. Organisms with eyes, limbs, shells, and purpose. The ocean was no longer just a backdrop for survival. It was a living stage of endless experiments. If you drifted through those waters, you'd see forms that defy modern comparison. Some glided like ribbons, some crawled across the seafloor on stubby legs, and others darted through the open water with grasping claws and wide alien eyes. Trilobites scuttled in countless varieties, their armoured shells glinting faintly under the filtered light. Above them, larger predators like Anomalocaris prowled, their bodies rippling as they searched for prey. Every movement, every shadow was new in the history of life. It was as if the ocean itself had woken from a long sleep and begun to dream. But it wasn't a peaceful dream. With complexity came conflict. For the first time, there were hunters and hunted. Life began to armour itself. Scales, shells, spines, all inventions born from necessity. The ocean's calm surface hid a new world of struggle beneath. Yet even in this raw competition, there was beauty. The patterns of shells, the symmetry of limbs, the intricate dances of survival, all hinted at something greater than instinct. Evolution was beginning to sculpt art out of necessity. The water back then would have looked familiar in colour, but strange in content. There were no fish as we know them yet, no corals, no seaweed forests. The seafloor was barren in places and coated in microbial mats in others, like velvet made of slime. The waves above broke against shores that were still empty of plants. The air was just learning how to support breath. But the groundwork was being laid. The ancient ocean was an artist, layering possibilities, shaping the world one tide at a time. As millions of years passed, life began to take new forms. Tiny invertebrates grew larger, skeletons hardened. Some creatures developed jaws, a small innovation that would lead to giants. The ocean, in its patience, nurtured them all. It gave them time to adapt, to fail, to try again. With each failure, evolution adjusted its hand, refining, improving, experimenting. And slowly the first fish began to appear. Simple, cartilaginous, but unmistakably fish. The ocean of this period was beginning to resemble the one you know, but it was far richer in nutrients. Volcanic activity released minerals into the water, feeding plankton blooms that would have turned parts of the sea milky green. The atmosphere still lacked balance, but oxygen levels were climbing, and that meant larger bodies could evolve. Somewhere deep in those currents, the potential for giants was quietly forming. If you could stand on the ancient shoreline, though there weren't many true shores yet, you would see the sun shimmering through mist, turning everything gold and pale blue. The smell of salt would be sharper than today, mixed with sulphur and the faint aroma of life itself. The sound would be strange too. Not waves on sand, but water crashing against bare rock. Wind howling through landscapes still being born. You'd feel very small there, and rightly so, because compared to the forces at work, even the mountains were young. That's the thing about the ocean during those early ages. It wasn't just a place where life existed. It was life's architect, sculpting, eroding, shaping not only creatures but continents. Tides carved the edges of land, currents distributed minerals, storms mixed the atmosphere. Everything depended on it, and that dependence has never really gone away. The same cycles that once fed trilobites still move through the world today, though the creatures they sustain have changed. Even now, every breath you take is touched by that ancient ocean. Half of the oxygen in the air still comes from marine plankton, descendants of those first cyanobacteria. The chemistry of your blood echoes seawater. Your heartbeat even follows a rhythm that mirrors the ocean's waves. Whether we realize it or not, we're all still tied to that original sea. When people ask what the ocean was like during the Age of Giants, they often imagine enormous creatures, and they're right to. But before we reach the age of Dunkleosteus and the marine reptiles, before the giants truly arrive, we have to understand the ocean's long patience. It took billions of years to become the stage where giants could exist. Every droplet carries that memory. Every wave that touches the shore is part of that unbroken chain. As we move deeper into this story, we'll see how the ocean evolved from a chemical experiment into a world of predators, explorers and titans. But even before those massive bodies swam through it, the ocean was already immense in another way. It was a teacher, showing that creation requires time, that growth needs balance, and that even chaos can lead to harmony when given long enough. So, for now, imagine that early ocean still stretching endlessly under a sky just learning to be blue. Imagine the first faint glimmer of light catching the back of a creature that had never seen itself reflected before. Picture it moving through the water, leaving a wake that disappears instantly yet somehow changes everything. That was the beginning of the Age of Giants, long before the giants themselves arrived. And the story of that ocean, the one that learned to breathe, to host, and to dream, has only just begun. When the world finally cooled enough to keep its oceans, the planet began to take its first real breath. The violent heat that had once kept the surface molten gave way to storms, endless and heavy, falling on plains of bare rock that hissed with steam. For millions of years it rained, and the air was a mix of carbon dioxide, methane and ammonia. Nothing about that early atmosphere would have welcomed you. The horizon was tinted orange, the clouds were thick as ash, and the sun often looked like a pale disk behind layers of haze. Yet in that unrecognisable world, the foundation for every future heartbeat was forming. Those first oceans were different from the blue expanses we see now. They were rich with dissolved minerals, iron, nickel, magnesium and countless other elements leached from volcanic rock. The water was greenish, sometimes brown, sometimes black with particles suspended like dust in the air. The waves carried heat from the Earth's crust, and the seafloor was alive with chemical reactions. The water itself was an experiment running without supervision. It mixed, it cooled, it reacted. At hydrothermal vents, those deep fissures where superheated water erupted from the crust, the first stirrings of life may have occurred. The chemistry was right. Energy, minerals, and a constant exchange between hot and cold, chaos and calm. When people picture the origin of life, they often imagine a single moment, a spark or miracle that happens suddenly. But that's not how the ocean works. The sea builds slowly, in cycles, in endless repetition. It doesn't rush. Molecules drifted, collided, broke apart and rejoined for eons before anything resembling life emerged. The first structures that could copy themselves didn't have shells or bodies. They were strands of molecules floating, dividing and mutating in the dark. Somewhere in that unseen world, a few of them found a pattern that worked, a way to pass on information, to persist. The ocean, in a sense, had begun to breathe. That breath wasn't made of air. It was made of chemistry, of reactions that produced energy and structure. Early cells may have fed on hydrogen and sulfur instead of oxygen, living off the warmth of the Earth's belly rather than sunlight. They didn't need eyes or movement or nerves. All they needed was time, and time was the one thing the ocean had plenty of. The planet then looked alien from above. The continents hadn't yet formed as we know them. Small land masses floated, collided, and sank again. Volcanoes rose and fell like bubbles in a simmering pot. The ocean stretched across nearly everything, and it was deep, much deeper than modern seas in many regions, though exact depths are impossible to know. The tides would have been stronger too, since the moon was closer, its pull more forceful. Every wave struck the shorelines of a changing world, eroding the young rock and carrying its minerals back into the water. That recycling of elements fed the chemical cycles that sustained early life. The sea wasn't just water. It was an enormous engine grinding away at stone, sky, and heat, keeping everything in motion. It's easy to forget that even now, the ocean and the atmosphere are not separate things. They exchange constantly, gases dissolving, evaporating, circulating. Back then, those exchanges shaped the planet's evolution. When the first photosynthetic microbes appeared, they began releasing oxygen, which didn't go straight into the air but into the ocean first. There it reacted with dissolved iron, forming rust that sank to the sea floor. Only after billions of years of this invisible work did oxygen begin to fill the sky. You could say that the ocean taught the atmosphere how to breathe. Life at that stage was simple but relentless. Every new organism was a variation of the same theme, a membrane, a way to gather energy, and a way to replicate. The ones that survived weren't the strongest or fastest, they were the ones that fit. The ocean rewarded adaptability, and that lesson still holds true today. Every creature alive, including you, is a continuation of that experiment, refined and expanded but not fundamentally changed. We're still built from saltwater chemistry, still dependent on cycles that began billions of years ago. As the ocean aged, its face changed. The water cleared as oxygen began to bind with metals and sink away. The colour shifted from murky green to blue. Sunlight started reaching deeper, and new forms of life began to exploit it. Microbes that could use light to create food spread rapidly, forming mats on the seafloor and near the surface. These microbial colonies were the first ecosystems. They built structures called stromatolites, layered formations that still exist in a few parts of the world today, like living fossils. Each layer was a record of sunlight captured and energy stored. If you could have stood in the shallows of one of those ancient seas, you wouldn't have seen movement. You'd see flat, lumpy mounds covering the seabed and stretching into the distance. The air above would have been heavy with carbon dioxide. No birds, no fish, no sound but the steady lap of waves and the distant hiss of volcanic vents. Yet under that quiet surface, oxygen was building, transforming the planet molecule by molecule. The great breath of the ocean was slowly exhaling life into the sky. When enough oxygen finally accumulated, it triggered what scientists call the Great Oxidation Event. It sounds dramatic, and it was. The chemistry of the world flipped. Many early organisms that had thrived without oxygen were poisoned by it, driven into extinction or forced to retreat to oxygen-free zones. But new life forms evolved to take advantage of the change. It was the planet's first mass extinction, followed immediately by its first great renewal. The ocean had reinvented itself, and everything that would come later, the plants, the animals, the giants, owed their existence to that single transformation. What's fascinating is that this shift didn't happen everywhere at once. Different parts of the ocean changed at different times, depending on depth, temperature, and currents. In shallow seas, oxygen built up first, supporting new types of bacteria and simple, multicellular organisms. In the deep, anoxic basins, the old forms lingered for millions of years longer, living in darkness and sulfur. Even now, there are places on Earth, at the bottom of the Black Sea for example, where those conditions still persist, echoing the ancient world. The past never completely disappears, it just moves out of sight. The seafloor of that time was a strange landscape. Sediment piled up from dead cells and mineral deposits, creating thick layers of clay and silt. The chemistry of those sediments began to trap carbon, locking it away and stabilizing the climate. In a very real sense, the ocean was regulating the planet's temperature, acting as both a furnace and a refrigerator. Too much heat and more carbon would dissolve into the water. Too little, and it would be released again. It was a feedback system long before anyone could name it. Over the next billion years, that stability allowed complexity to build. Cells began working together, forming colonies where different members performed specialized tasks. Some handled energy, others structure, others reproduction. Cooperation had entered the evolutionary script. The first multicellular organisms emerged, delicate and soft, floating near the surface or anchored to the seafloor. None of them had skeletons yet, so few left fossils, but we know they existed from chemical traces and microfossils preserved in ancient rocks. The ocean's breathing grew stronger. Oxygen levels rose higher than ever before. Weather patterns shifted, currents strengthened, and the climate began to cool. At least twice in Earth's history, the cooling became so extreme that ice covered nearly the entire planet, a phenomenon scientists call snowball Earth. For millions of years, the ocean's surface may have been frozen, with only pockets of liquid water surviving near volcanic regions. Yet even then, life endured beneath the ice, feeding off chemical energy from the deep. When the ice finally melted, the influx of nutrients triggered another explosion of life. The ocean inhaled again, this time with a vigor that would change everything. That rejuvenated world gave rise to new forms, creatures with bodies capable of moving independently, feeding and reproducing in coordinated ways. The first true animals had arrived, though they bore little resemblance to anything familiar. Sponges, jelly-like organisms, and strange, disc-shaped beings drifted through the ancient water. Some attached themselves to the seafloor, others floated freely. The ocean had evolved from chemistry to community, and this was only the prelude to the great bloom of diversity that would follow. The stage was set for the Cambrian period, when life would burst into complexity and shape the structure of marine ecosystems for the next 500 million years. But the ocean, patient as always, didn't rush. It layered one innovation on top of another, building from simplicity towards sophistication. Every breath it took filled the planet with possibility. If we trace all of this forward, through time and evolution, it's hard not to feel a kind of recognition. The salt in your veins is almost identical to the concentration of salt in those early seas. The trace elements that keep your cells running, iron, calcium, magnesium, were first dissolved there. Even your earliest ancestors, the single cells that started this chain, floated in that same water. When you breathe, you're continuing a rhythm that began when the ocean first learned to exchange gases with the sky. You're part of the same cycle. The ocean's breath was never just about sustaining life, it was about balance. Every change it made, adding oxygen, cooling the air, nurturing ecosystems, was part of a larger pattern that allowed complexity to survive. That pattern hasn't stopped. Modern oceans still inhale carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen. They still regulate the climate, feed the atmosphere, and protect life from extremes. They still breathe, just as they did when the world was young. If you think about it long enough, you realise that every story of life begins with water taking a breath. The age of giants, with its monstrous fish and immense reptiles, couldn't have existed without the groundwork laid by these early waves. They were the first to move energy across the planet, the first to connect heat, light, and matter in a stable cycle. Before there were fins, teeth, or scales, there was the pulse of chemistry, the rhythm of tides turning into metabolism, and metabolism turning into life. Even now, that rhythm hasn't ended. The sea continues its slow respiration, exchanging gases with the sky, absorbing sunlight, and circulating nutrients. When the wind passes over the surface of the water, it carries invisible traces of that breath inland. It becomes the humidity in the air, the rain that falls, the rivers that return to the ocean again. That is how the planet breathes, and it has been doing so for nearly 4 billion years. The first great waves were not just movements of water, they were the first signs of order forming from chaos. Each swell carried energy, each tide shaped the land, each current distributed the raw materials of life. Over time, those patterns carved out the conditions necessary for evolution's next leap, the creation of creatures with form, motion, and awareness. When you stand by the sea today and watch the water roll in and out, you're seeing the same process that began in those ancient days. The same breathing, the same exchange between ocean and sky. The waves you hear now are distant descendants of those first great movements, still repeating their rhythm as if time itself were secondary to the tide. From that steady pulse, everything followed. The chemistry became biology. The stillness became motion. The earth, once silent and fiery, became a world that could host not just life but wonder. And though the ocean has changed colour, temperature and depth countless times since, it has never stopped breathing. It still carries the memory of its first inhale, the trace of the moment when water learned how to give and receive, to sustain and transform, and somewhere in that long history of breaths and tides, the seeds of the giants were planted. They would come later, immense and elegant, each one a reflection of the ocean's patience. But before they arrived, the sea had to learn how to live. It had to learn how to breathe, and once it did, the planet would never be the same again. When the first tiny architects of life took hold beneath the surface, the ocean's quiet began to fill with purpose. There were no roars or crashes to mark the moment, only the faint stirring of invisible empires beginning their patient conquest of the deep. These microscopic monarchs were unlike anything the planet had ever known. They didn't build with stone or rule with strength. They conquered the world by multiplication, by persistence, by the simple act of existing more efficiently than anything else could. The ocean that once moved only with heat and tides was now alive with the slow rhythm of growth. At this point in Earth's history, life was still invisible to the naked eye. The seas looked empty, but every droplet carried entire civilizations. The water shimmered faintly with suspended particles, though none of them were light, they were cells. The first true cells had learned how to feed, how to divide, and how to adapt. They were prokaryotes, bacteria without nuclei, simple yet astonishingly capable. Each was a miniature factory, processing chemicals, releasing waste, building structure. Billions of them drifted together, forming the ocean's first true ecosystem. It's strange to think that the earliest empire on Earth was built without intention, yet that's exactly what it was. These microbes didn't know they were changing the planet, but they were. Some consumed hydrogen sulfide from volcanic vents. Others relied on iron or nitrogen or methane. They lived in thin layers on rocks, coating them like film. When the waves passed over, those layers caught sunlight and nutrients, creating something entirely new, the first sustainable cycle. The ocean was learning balance through its smallest inhabitants. Among these ancient rulers were cyanobacteria, sometimes called blue-green algae, though they were not algae at all. They were the first organisms to harness light and use it to split water, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. That small innovation changed the fate of the planet. Imagine billions of microscopic cells, each one performing photosynthesis, each one quietly exhaling oxygen into the water. Over millions of years, those invisible breaths accumulated until the chemistry of the entire world began to shift. The atmosphere thickened, the colour of the sky changed, and the surface of the ocean transformed from green to blue. Without these tiny creatures, there would be no ozone, no breathable air, no higher life. Every forest, every animal, every human thought owes its existence to these small ancient cells, floating in a prehistoric sea. They thrived in colonies, clustering into mats that covered the shallows. These mats were the foundation of the first reefs, though they were not made of coral or limestone but of microbial film. Layer upon layer, they built structures that reached upward toward the light. Stromatolites, as scientists later called them, were living records of life's persistence. Each layer represented a day's work, cells trapping sediment, dividing and growing again. Over centuries, the layers hardened into stone, preserving the story of their creation. You can still find them today, rising from the shallow waters of places like Shark Bay in Western Australia. Their rounded forms almost identical to those that grew billions of years ago. They are among the oldest living structures on Earth, direct descendants of that microscopic conquest. The ocean during this time was not peaceful in a gentle sense. It was active, chemical, restless. Currents carried nutrients from hydrothermal vents to the surface and back again. Rainstorms washed minerals from young continents into the water, feeding blooms of bacteria that turned entire regions opaque with life. The planet was still volatile. Volcanic eruptions darkened the sky, meteorites struck from above, and continents shifted under pressure. But through every upheaval, the microbes endured. They were not fragile. They were adaptable, living in boiling water in acidic pools, in darkness where no sunlight could reach. Some found shelter in the cracks of rocks beneath the seafloor, forming hidden biospheres that would outlast every cataclysm. It was during this microscopic age that the first forms of cooperation appeared. Cells began clustering together not just for protection but for efficiency. In colonies, some cells specialized in gathering energy, others in reproduction, others in defense. This division of labor was the beginning of complexity. Evolution had discovered teamwork. Though the individuals remained small, their collective impact grew immense. The ocean's chemistry was now fully linked to its biology, a self-sustaining network that would only become more intricate with time. The deep ocean also became a refuge for different kinds of life. Far from sunlight, communities formed around hydrothermal vents. These ecosystems were powered not by photosynthesis, but by chemosynthesis, the conversion of chemicals into energy. Microbes there fed on hydrogen sulfide, turning poison into sustenance. Around them, strange tube-like organisms and primitive worms began to appear, each one dependent on the bacteria for survival. Even at this early stage, the principle of food webs had begun. Every life form depended on another. The diversity among these microbes was astonishing. Some evolved the ability to fix nitrogen, transforming inert gas from the atmosphere into forms that other organisms could use. Others learned to store energy, or to move with the help of tiny rotating filaments. Some developed simple sensors to detect light or chemicals, primitive precursors to eyes and noses. Evolution wasn't just creating species, it was testing ideas. The ocean was its laboratory, and every new trait that worked was recorded, refined, and passed on. If you could shrink yourself to the scale of one of these microbes and drift among them, you would see the water not as a clear expanse, but as a dense, shimmering cloud of motion. Every cubic centimetre would contain millions of lives. The surface film of the ocean, where air and water meet, would be a riot of energy. Cells dividing, feeding, dying, and being replaced in endless cycles. The sound, if you could hear it, would be a soft hiss of activity, like a distant current of static electricity. The world of the small was not empty at all. It was crowded, noisy, and alive with unseen battles and alliances. Over time, some microbes developed internal structures that made them more efficient. They became the ancestors of eukaryotic cells, organisms with nuclei and organelles. This was another quiet revolution, perhaps the most important since life began. These new cells could store DNA in organized compartments, protect it, and use it to produce more complex proteins. They could grow larger, move faster, and adapt in ways bacteria could not. The ocean was entering a new chapter in its invisible history, one that would eventually lead to multicellular organisms. But this transformation was not instantaneous. For hundreds of millions of years, eukaryotes and bacteria coexisted, often merging through symbiosis. One cell absorbed another, not to digest it, but to use it. Inside some of these ancient mergers, bacteria that could harness sunlight became permanent residents. Chloroplasts, the ancestors of the green engines in every plant cell today. Others that could process oxygen became mitochondria, the powerhouses of all complex life. What began as an accident became the foundation for every animal, plant and fungus that would ever exist. The ocean, in fostering these alliances, had effectively invented complexity itself. The microscopic empires flourished in every environment. In shallows, colonies photosynthesized beneath sunlight. In the mid-depths, drifting plankton captured nutrients as they fell from above. In the darkness of the deep sea, chemosynthetic organisms thrived around vents that glowed faintly with mineral-rich plumes. The ocean's layers became distinct worlds, each with its own rules. Currents acted as couriers, moving nutrients between these worlds, ensuring that nothing truly isolated could last. Everything was connected by flow. This period also marked the slow creation of what we now call the carbon cycle. When microbes died, their remains sank, taking carbon with them to the seafloor. Some of it became buried, eventually forming the sedimentary rocks that still store ancient organic carbon today. This process moderated the atmosphere, keeping greenhouse gases in check and stabilizing the climate. The planet's first environmental balance came not from continents or weather, but from the quiet work of countless cells dying and settling into the deep. Their deaths, in a sense, kept the world alive. As life continued to multiply, the ocean grew clearer. Iron and sulfur became scarce in the upper layers, replaced by oxygen and nitrate. The chemistry that had once favoured simple reactions now supported complexity. Larger eukaryotes began to feed on smaller bacteria, marking the birth of predation. It might seem strange to think of microscopic hunting, but this was the beginning of one of nature's oldest interactions, the chase between hunter and prey. The ocean's calm surface hid microscopic dramas of pursuit, capture and consumption. Each encounter reshaped evolution, favouring speed, perception and resilience. While these interactions played out in miniature, the planet itself continued to shift. Supercontinents formed and broke apart. Mountain ranges rose and eroded. The composition of the air fluctuated. Yet through every geological convulsion, the microbial world remained steady. Its adaptability ensured continuity, and its constant recycling of nutrients kept the biosphere functioning. No other form of life could yet rival their dominance. They were the true rulers of Earth, invisible but absolute. The influence of these tiny organisms extended far beyond biology. They shaped minerals, influenced weather, and even affected the colour of the ocean. The iron bands in ancient rock formations are their signatures. The balance of gases in the air is their legacy. Every geological layer from that time carries traces of their activity. The fingerprints of life so small it could barely be imagined, yet so powerful it changed the course of the planet. When we look at the modern ocean, we still see their descendants everywhere. Every litre of seawater contains millions of bacterial and algal cells, quietly doing the same work as their ancestors, photosynthesizing, decomposing, regulating the atmosphere. The oxygen you breathe right now likely comes from marine microbes, not trees. The invisible continues to sustain the visible. That's the hidden continuity of the ocean story. The quiet conquest of the deep was not a war of expansion, but a gradual saturation. The ocean didn't need kings or armies. It needed replication. It needed patience. The microbes spread until there was no corner of the water they hadn't touched, no environment they couldn't adapt to. They endured ice ages, warming periods and chemical shifts. They filled every niche the planet could offer, and in doing so, they prepared the way for everything larger that would follow. By the time complex animals began to evolve, the groundwork was already perfect. The ocean's chemistry was stable, its oxygen levels high, its nutrients circulating efficiently. The great waves of earlier ages had carved the basins and the microscopic monarchs had filled them with life. It was only a matter of time before evolution scaled up its experiments. The giants would come, but they would come to a world already ruled by the small. When you trace your ancestry back far enough, beyond mammals, beyond fish, beyond even the first multicellular creatures, you arrive here, to these unseen rulers of the ancient ocean. Every heartbeat is built on their invention of energy transfer. Every breath is borrowed from their ancient exchange of gases. Their story is not finished. It continues in every tide pool, every droplet, every living cell that divides. The conquest of the deep was quiet, but it was complete. Long before the age of armour and the rise of monstrous fish, the smallest beings had already transformed the planet. They turned stone to soil, gas to air, and water to a cradle of life. They were patient, relentless, and invisible. And as the world turned slowly beneath its new blue sky, the ocean prepared for its next transformation. The moment when small would give way to large, and the age of hidden rulers would pass its crown to creatures that would finally be seen. By the time the ocean had finished its long age of invisibility, something remarkable was already underway beneath the surface. After billions of years ruled by microscopic life, the sea was ready for change. The chemistry was right, the oxygen levels were high, and the seafloor had become a mosaic of nutrients. All the quiet preparation was building toward a moment when the invisible would become visible, when the tiny would give rise to the complex. It began slowly, as all great transformations do, but soon the world was teeming with forms and movements no one could have imagined before. The Cambrian period had begun, and the ocean was about to overflow with possibility. If you were to travel back to those ancient waters, you'd recognise almost nothing. The continents were smaller and scattered, many still forming. The air was thick, the atmosphere dense, and the day itself was shorter because the planet rotated faster. The light that reached the ocean floor was faint and greenish, but it was enough. Life had evolved from the microscopic to the macroscopic, from film to form. The seafloor that once looked barren was now crawling with creatures. For the first time, the ocean had structure, a living architecture of bodies, shells, and movement. It's difficult to convey just how revolutionary this was. For nearly 3 billion years, life had existed as single cells or soft colonies. Now, within a geological blink, almost every major animal group appeared. Biologists call it the Cambrian explosion, not because it happened overnight, but because, in comparison to everything before, evolution suddenly accelerated. Creatures with eyes, limbs, skeletons, and complex organs filled the seas. There were hunters and prey, burrowers and swimmers, grazers and drifters. The rules of existence had changed. The ocean at that time was divided into layers of colour and light. Near the surface, plankton floated in dense blooms, feeding the new world below. The middle depths shimmered with the movement of animals that rose and fell with the tides. And on the seafloor, communities formed among soft sediments, reefs, and microbial mats. The water was warmer than today, rich in calcium and carbon dioxide, a combination that allowed shells and exoskeletons to develop easily. Evolution seized the opportunity. Among the first to appear were trilobites. They would become one of the most successful creatures in Earth's history, surviving for over 270 million years. Their bodies were segmented and covered in armour-like plates, flexible enough to curl into a ball for protection. They crawled across the seabed like slow, cautious beetles, feeding on detritus or hunting smaller organisms. Their compound eyes, made of calcite lenses, were among the earliest examples of true vision. For the first time, the ocean could see itself. Around them swam other strange and elegant forms. Some were soft and transparent like ribbons drifting in the current. Others were covered in spikes and ridges, as if evolution couldn't decide on a single design and tried them all. One of the most striking predators was Anomalocaris, a creature nearly a metre long, enormous for its time. It had a segmented body, flapping fins, and two grasping appendages in front of its mouth that it used to capture prey. Its eyes were large and complex, and it could maneuver with speed that smaller animals couldn't match. For millions of years, it was the ocean's dominant hunter, gliding through the Cambrian seas like a living machine. But not every creature was a predator. Many were scavengers or filter feeders, content to sift through sediment or strain nutrients from the water. There were worms that burrowed in the mud, tiny crustacean-like animals that darted between grains of sand, and jelly-like beings that pulsed gently upward with the light. Some creatures anchored themselves to the seafloor and grew in branching patterns, early versions of what we would one day call corals. Others formed colonies, building frameworks that stabilized the sediment and provided shelter for smaller organisms. The ocean was becoming a city, each level busy with life. The evolution of shells and skeletons changed everything. Before this, most life forms were soft-bodied, leaving almost no trace behind when they died. But now, calcium carbonate and silica were being used to build protection. These hard parts provided defense against predators, structure for movement, and by accident a way to leave fossils. The Cambrian explosion is visible to us precisely because its inhabitants learned how to endure in stone. The ocean floor became littered with the remains of shells and carapaces, layering over time into the rock formations we study today. One of the most fascinating aspects of this period is how quickly ecosystems formed. In a matter of millions of years, a short span in geological terms, food webs stabilized. There were base producers, grazers, mid-level predators, and apex hunters. Energy moved efficiently through the system, cycling from sunlight to plankton to trilobite to Anomalocaris and back again. The delicate balance that defines modern ecosystems was already taking shape. The ocean had found a rhythm. Yet despite this explosion of life, the environment was not stable. Sea levels rose and fell dramatically as glaciers waxed and waned. Periodic, anoxic events, where oxygen levels in the water dropped, wiped out entire populations. But every collapse was followed by renewal. Evolution thrived on disruption. Each extinction opened niches for new forms to evolve, pushing the diversity of life even further. If you could swim through those ancient waters, you'd be struck by how alien they looked. The colours were muted, soft greens, blues and browns. But the movements were constant. The seafloor pulsed with life. Tiny creatures filtered water through feathery appendages, leaving trails in the sand. Others dug tunnels and burrows, oxygenating the sediment and shaping habitats for future generations. Everywhere, something was moving, building, feeding, or hiding. The silence would be deceptive. The ecosystem was as dynamic as a coral reef, only stranger. For the first time, the ocean was filled with competition. Evolution favoured sight, speed, and strength. Animals that could sense their surroundings had an advantage, and so eyes evolved in multiple lineages. The ability to perceive light, shadow, and movement turned the ocean into a more dangerous place, but also a more interactive one. Predator and prey were locked in an endless cycle of adaptation. Better armour led to sharper claws, faster movement led to more agile hunters. Life was learning about conflict. This newfound diversity also affected the planet itself. As more organisms developed shells, they drew calcium from the water, altering its chemistry. The burial of carbon in shells and sediments gradually reduced greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, cooling the planet. The ocean and the air were locked in feedback once again, each responding to changes in the other. The biological and geological had become inseparable. In deeper waters, the forms were even stranger. Some creatures floated upside down, feeding on particles that drifted down from above. Others used long spines or fins to stabilize themselves in near darkness. Fossils from places like the Burgess Shale in Canada and the Chengjiang site in China reveal an astonishing range of body plans. Animals with multiple sets of eyes, with fans of spines, with soft fringes for swimming or crawling. Many of these designs were evolutionary experiments that didn't last, but a few became the ancestors of modern groups: arthropods, mollusks, chordates. The blueprints for crabs, snails, and even fish were being drafted here. One small, unassuming creature from this time called Pikaia is of particular interest. It had a flexible rod running along its back, a notochord, which would later evolve into the spinal column of vertebrates. From this tiny swimmer, moving slowly across the Cambrian seabed, came every fish, reptile, bird, and mammal that would follow. It's a humbling lineage. The first stirrings of our own ancestry began in these ancient seas, among trilobites and worm-like scavengers, in a world utterly unlike our own. The Cambrian Ocean was also home to the earliest reefs built by animals. These weren't coral reefs as we know them today, but structures made by sponges and microbial communities. They provided shelter and feeding grounds, stabilising the marine environment and allowing more complex ecosystems to form. The reef as an idea, a structure that supports a community, was born here. The currents that moved through these seas were slower and thicker than modern ones, heavy with suspended particles. Tides reshaped coastlines, carrying nutrients from shallow to deep. Every storm redistributed life. Many creatures lived close to the sediment, relying on the detritus that rained down from above. Others migrated vertically each day, rising toward the light by morning and sinking back into the dark by night. The rhythm of day and night had become biological law. The appearance of complex life didn't just alter the ocean, it changed the very way the planet functioned. The movement of living bodies stirred sediments, mixing oxygen into the seafloor. The decomposition of organisms fed new growth. The cycling of nutrients accelerated. The ocean became self-sustaining in a way it had never been before. Life wasn't just existing within the environment anymore. It was shaping it. It's easy to imagine the Cambrian Sea as chaotic, but it wasn't disorganized. There was an underlying order to it, a set of ecological roles that mirrored what we see in modern ecosystems. There were scavengers that recycled dead matter, filter feeders that cleaned the water, grazers that controlled algae, and predators that kept populations in check. The balance wasn't perfect, but it was functional. For the first time, Earth had a biosphere that resembled the one we know, and through it all, evolution kept experimenting. Some animals grew larger, testing the limits of oxygen diffusion and circulation. Others grew spines or shells in bizarre shapes that served no clear purpose, but may have confused predators. Some developed rudimentary limbs, jointed and capable of more precise motion. The variety was staggering. The Cambrian Ocean was nature's workshop, filled with prototypes, some successful, others destined for extinction, all vital to what would come next. The beauty of this period lies in its unpredictability. Evolution didn't follow a straight path. It branched, looped, and retraced its steps. A feature that worked for one organism might appear in another through entirely different means. Eyes evolved independently several times. Shells, too, emerged from multiple lineages. It was as if the ocean itself was exploring possibilities, trying to find the most efficient ways to live, to move, to survive. As the Cambrian drew on, the variety of life continued to expand. Trilobites diversified into hundreds of species, some small as grains of sand, others as large as dinner plates. Armoured worms bored through sediments, leaving trace fossils that still puzzle scientists. Floating creatures evolved air-filled chambers to control buoyancy. Early versions of what would later become the swim bladders of fish. Everywhere there was innovation. The ocean had become a playground for evolution's creativity. Yet even in this abundance, extinction was constant. Most species that evolved during the Cambrian would vanish long before the next era. Nature's experiments were relentless, but they weren't wasteful. Every failure left behind genetic possibilities for something new. The resilience of life lay not in stability, but in its capacity to adapt. The Cambrian Ocean, for all its strangeness, set the template for everything that followed. The structure of food webs, the relationship between predator and prey, the cycles of oxygen and carbon, all of it began here. The ocean was no longer just a cradle of life. It had become a living, breathing system of endless interaction. As the eons passed, these early creatures evolved further. Some developed true skeletons, others ventured into new environments, exploring the edges of the sea. Their descendants would one day crawl onto land, but for now, they ruled the water. The age of microscopic monarchs had given way to a world of visible movement, colour, and competition. The ocean had gone from quiet chemistry to active biology. And though most of those creatures are gone, the pattern they created remains. Every coral reef, every tidal pool, every school of fish echoes that original expansion of possibility. The Cambrian seas proved that life could be diverse, adaptable, and creative. They were the ocean's first masterpiece, the beginning of everything complex. The water that once shimmered with trilobites and anomalocarids has long since cooled and changed, but its influence hasn't faded. When you look into the sea today, you're seeing the end of a process that began 500 million years ago, a process that turned chemistry into consciousness, chaos into ecology, simplicity into complexity. The ocean has never stopped creating, it only changes the scale of its imagination. From those ancient reefs and shadowed shallows, life would continue to grow larger, stronger and stranger. The seas that once shimmered with soft bodies would soon become home to armoured fish, to predators the size of cars, to creatures that could swallow others whole. The next act in the ocean story would not be quiet. The age of giants was beginning to stir beneath the waves, and the calm, balanced world of the Cambrian was only its first whisper. As life filled the seas with colour and movement, a new kind of tension began to shape the water. The Cambrian world had proven that the ocean could sustain complexity, but it had also revealed a new challenge: survival. Every living creature was both hunter and hunted, builder and destroyer, drifting between creation and defence. The balance that had once been chemical was now behavioural. And in the slow grind of evolution, that meant change. The ocean began to favour those who could endure attack, those who could harden themselves against teeth, claws, and chance. The soft bodies of early creatures were no longer enough. This was the age when life learned to protect itself. This was the age of armour. It started small, almost imperceptibly. Tiny deposits of calcium carbonate appeared within the tissues of some animals. At first, these were just internal reinforcements, bits of structure that helped maintain shape. But over generations, they grew thicker, forming plates, spines, and shells. What had once been fluid and soft became rigid and durable. Evolution had discovered armour, and the ocean began to change shape around it. The seafloor that once shimmered with flexible worms and gelatinous forms now crawled with creatures encased in shells. Trilobites thickened their exoskeletons. Mollusks developed sturdy, coiled homes that they could retreat into. Early sponges and corals secreted minerals to create reefs dense enough to resist currents. The water, once dominated by movement, now had structure. Every inch of the seabed became a fortress or a trap. For the creatures that couldn't or wouldn't harden themselves, the only option was speed. The invention of armour led to an evolutionary arms race. Faster swimmers evolved streamlined bodies and stronger muscles to escape predators. Hunters developed jaws and teeth capable of cracking shells. Each adaptation led to another in response, a constant back and forth of attack and defence. The ocean was inventing strategy. One of the earliest examples of this escalation was the rise of jawless fish, the agnathons. They were among the first vertebrates, animals with a backbone, though their skeletons were made of cartilage rather than bone. To defend themselves, many developed thick plates of armour around their heads and bodies, a protective barrier that also made them heavy and slow. They weren't graceful, but they were resilient. These armoured fish glided near the bottom, feeding on detritus or filtering small organisms from the mud. Their plated forms were like moving shields, silent and deliberate. The appearance of armoured vertebrates marked a turning point. For the first time, internal structure and external armour worked together. The backbone provided stability, while the bony plates offered defence. It was a design that would evolve endlessly in the millions of years to come. Some species grew small, interlocking scales that functioned like chainmail. Others developed thick, solid plates that made them nearly invincible to attack. The ocean had filled with living tanks, but armour came with trade-offs. Protection meant weight, and weight meant slower movement. Heavily armoured creatures couldn't flee easily or chase prey over long distances. That limitation forced evolution to explore new solutions. Some species reduced their armour but developed better senses. Eyes that could see farther, lateral lines that could detect vibrations, chemical receptors that could sense prey from meters away. Others found new ways to move, using undulating fins or jet propulsion. The evolutionary arms race didn't favour any single strategy. It rewarded innovation. In shallow seas, trilobites still dominated, but even their world was changing. Some grew spines to deter predators, others flattened their bodies to hide beneath sediment. A few species developed intricate patterns of bumps and ridges that may have helped with camouflage or hydrodynamics. The fossil record shows entire ecosystems of these armoured crawlers, living in swarms that must have blanketed the sea floor. They were the ocean's equivalent of insects, numerous, adaptable, and endlessly inventive. Further offshore, new predators began to test the balance. Early cephalopods, ancestors of squid and octopuses, evolved chambered shells that allowed them to control buoyancy. They could float effortlessly, rise or sink by adjusting the gas in their shells, and strike with surprising accuracy. Unlike the slow-moving trilobites or armoured fish, these hunters combined intelligence with agility. They were the first creatures to use precision as a weapon. The ocean's first thinkers had arrived. The age of armour was not simply about defence, it was about structure, both physical and ecological. The spread of hard parts reshaped the way energy moved through the ecosystem. Dead shells and bones accumulated on the seafloor, forming new layers of sediment. These materials trapped carbon, helping regulate the planet's atmosphere and temperature. The same process that gave animals protection also stabilised the environment. The ocean, as always, found balance through adaptation. The reefs of this time grew larger and more intricate. Built from sponges, corals, and shell-building organisms, they became refuges for smaller creatures and ambush points for predators. The diversity of life within these reefs rivaled anything that would come later. Small arthropods cleaned the surfaces of larger animals. Worms tunneled through the sediment, aerating it. Mollusks clung to coral branches, filtering nutrients from the water. The interconnectedness of these early reef systems laid the groundwork for every complex ecosystem that followed. Yet the ocean was not always gentle to its creations. Periodic oxygen shortages in the water caused massive die-offs, wiping out large sections of life. Volcanic eruptions poured ash and minerals into the seas, changing their chemistry overnight. But life recovered each time, often stronger than before. Each collapse forced innovation. When oxygen returned, creatures grew larger. When new minerals entered the water, shells diversified in colour and composition. Evolution thrived on instability. The fossil record from this period reads like a catalogue of possibilities. There were placoderms, heavily armoured fish with jaws powerful enough to crush bone. Some reached lengths of several meters, their bodies encased in bony plates that overlapped like scales of steel. They were slow, but they didn't need speed. A single bite from one could shear through nearly anything smaller. Dunkleosteus, the largest of them all, would one day dominate the Devonian seas, but even its ancestors were formidable. Their jaws weren't true teeth, but sharp bone plates that acted like blades, and when they closed, they generated one of the strongest bite forces in history. To coexist with predators like these, Smaller species adapted in subtler ways. Some developed flexible shells that could bend without breaking. Others grew elongated bodies that allowed them to slip into cracks and crevices for safety. A few evolved toxins or stinging cells to deter attack, early versions of the defences still found in jellyfish and cone snails today. The evolutionary story of armour wasn't just about hardness, it was about creativity under pressure. As armoured fish multiplied, so did their competitors. Early sharks, lean and cartilaginous, emerged as a counterpoint to their plated cousins. They had no armour but made up for it with speed and sensory precision. Their skin was covered in tiny tooth-like scales that reduced drag and made them nearly silent in the water. They hunted by sensing electric fields, detecting prey even in murky darkness. The duel between armour and agility had begun, a conflict that would shape marine life for hundreds of millions of years. The reefs and shallows became battlegrounds of design. Creatures tested new body plans and survival strategies, each one pushing evolution in a different direction. Some fish developed fins that acted like limbs, allowing them to rest on the seafloor or push through obstacles. Others experimented with suction feeding, drawing prey into their mouths by creating a sudden vacuum. The diversity of approaches was staggering. Nature didn't choose one solution, it tested them all. Even as predators grew more efficient, the builders of the ocean continued their slow, steady work. Corals, sponges, and calcareous algae expanded their structures, creating vast limestone platforms that stretched for miles. These early reef systems were not yet the tropical havens we know today, but they were already engines of biodiversity. Every surface supported life. Every crevice hid a potential survivor. The reef was both armour and womb, a place where the fragile could endure. Over time, the constant recycling of calcium and carbon began to leave its mark on the planet. The deposition of shells and skeletons built thick layers of limestone, which would later become mountain ranges. The ocean was literally constructing the bones of continents. Each wave that broke on a Cambrian or Ordovician shore was contributing grain by grain to the land that future civilizations would walk upon. The sea's armour was turning into the Earth's memory. In this age, movement and stillness coexisted in equilibrium. The armoured fish drifted heavily, like underwater tanks. Trilobites scuttled in vast herds, sweeping the seabed clean. Above them, soft-bodied predators darted like shadows, probing the defences below. The water was thick with life, but it was no longer vulnerable. The age of fragility had passed. The ocean had grown teeth, shells, and spines, and with them a new kind of beauty. Every adaptation had a cost. Armour made breathing harder, so many species evolved more efficient gills. Heavier bodies demanded stronger muscles, leading to changes in internal support structures. To maintain buoyancy, some developed gas-filled organs, precursors to swim bladders. Each problem created an opportunity. The balance between protection and mobility was delicate, and life navigated it with endless experimentation. What's remarkable about this period is how much of its legacy still lives in modern seas. The scales of fish, the shells of mollusks, the exoskeletons of crustaceans, all are echoes of this age. Even our bones, strengthened with calcium and protected by skin, carry the same logic. We are all inheritors of that ancient lesson. To survive is to adapt. To endure is to build structure without losing flexibility. The Age of Armour was more than an evolutionary phase. It was the ocean learning about permanence. Before this time, life came and went quickly, its traces erased by decay. Now every creature left a record. Fossils became time capsules, preserving moments of struggle and adaptation. Through them, the ocean began to write its autobiography in stone. But even as life fortified itself, the environment continued to shift. Continents collided, raising mountains and altering currents. The chemistry of the sea fluctuated as volcanic gases mixed with the atmosphere. With every geological change came a new evolutionary challenge. Species rose and fell in response, their success determined not by strength alone but by balance, between armour and agility, defence and innovation. By the end of this era, the ocean was more dynamic than ever. Giant predators prowled its depths, and reefs teemed with creatures of every shape and size. The variety of shells and spines was astonishing. Spirals, cones, plates, fans, spikes. Each one represented a story of survival written in calcium. The sea had become both battlefield and sanctuary, where danger and beauty were indistinguishable. If you could stand on a shoreline from that time, though no grass or trees would have greeted you yet, you'd see water alive with motion. Shadows of fish gliding just below the surface, flashes of armour catching sunlight, the slow ripple of reefs beneath waves. The air would carry a metallic tang, the smell of minerals and salt. Beneath it all, the rhythm of life would pulse steadily, measured not in heartbeats, but in tides. That rhythm never stopped. It continues in every wave that touches a shore, in every shell that washes up on sand. The story of the ocean's armour is the story of persistence, of how life learned to endure pressure by transforming it into strength. The giants that would soon rule these waters were made possible by the resilience forged here. They would inherit an ocean already sculpted by conflict, already filled with survivors who had turned vulnerability into endurance. The sea had hardened its skin, and in doing so, it had prepared for its most dramatic chapter yet. The giants were coming, not as sudden invaders, but as the next expression of everything the ocean had learned. The slow accumulation of armour, the rise of predators, the constant negotiation between fragility and strength. All of it was leading to them. The world was ready for the titans of the tides, and the ocean, patient as ever, was about to test the limits of its creation. The ocean had spent hundreds of millions of years preparing for size. It had experimented with shells, exoskeletons and armour, testing how much weight and protection life could carry. It had adjusted its chemistry, built reefs, and balanced its oxygen. By the time the Devonian period arrived, everything was in place for a new transformation. The seas had matured. They were clear, oxygen-rich, and bursting with energy. It was time for the giants to rise. The Devonian is often called the Age of Fishes, and for good reason. Nowhere else in Earth's history did the ocean host such a spectacular variety of fish, each experimenting with different forms and functions. Some glided through open water like living blades. Others hugged the seafloor, armoured and immovable. Some were small, agile and swift, while others were immense, slow-moving predators with jaws that could shear bone. The sea had become a theatre of giants, and every current carried the echoes of their movement. If you could drift through those ancient waters, the first thing you would notice is how alive the ocean felt. The reefs were immense, stretching for miles across continental shelves. Built from corals, sponges and lime-secreting organisms, they were dense ecosystems filled with colour and motion. Shoals of small fish moved in unison through gaps between the corals, their scales flashing like mirrors. Crustaceans scuttled over the reef surface. Early sharks patrolled the edges, sleek and silent. The sound, if you could translate it into human terms, would have been a low hum of motion, fins cutting through water, shells scraping rock, the deep resonance of constant life. Among these reefs lived creatures that dwarfed almost everything that had come before them. The placiderms were the rulers of the Devonian seas, massive armoured fish with heads encased in bony plates. The largest, Dunkleosteus, was an apex predator unlike anything the ocean had seen. Growing up to 10 metres long, it had jaws made not of teeth, but of sharp, interlocking bone plates that acted like shears. Its bite force was so immense that it could crush through armour or snap prey in half with a single motion. Its head was a fortress, its body a machine built for slow, deliberate power. Nothing in the water was truly safe when it was near. Yet Dunkleosteus wasn't the only giant. The oceans were filled with predators of every design. Some placoderms were smaller but more agile, darting through coral mazes to ambush prey. Others fed on plankton, filtering the water with gill structures instead of hunting. The variety was astounding. The Devonian Ocean had evolved not one kind of giant, but many, each dominating a different niche, each pushing evolution in a new direction. Further below, where sunlight faded and pressure rose, the world changed. The open seas were ruled by creatures built for endurance. Early sharks, still primitive compared to their modern descendants, prowled through the dim blue. They had sleek, flexible bodies and skin covered in tiny scales that reduced drag. They moved with a quiet precision that made them nearly invisible until they struck. While placoderms relied on brute strength, sharks used patience and stealth. It was a duel of methods, armor versus agility, power versus silence. This balance between strength and speed defined the Devonian. The ocean wasn't just filled with predators, it was filled with strategies. Some creatures relied on camouflage, blending into the sand or coral to avoid detection. Others evolved spines or toxins as deterrents. Even small fish developed schooling behaviours, moving in coordinated swarms to confuse attackers. For every offence, there was a defence. The ecosystem had become a complex web of action and reaction. The surface waters shimmered with plant-like organisms, early algae and primitive forms of seaweed, creating floating forests that sheltered smaller creatures. Beneath them, the reefs teemed with colour and motion. It was here that bones, true bones made of hardened tissue, began to evolve in earnest. Fish that once had flexible cartilage now developed rigid skeletons, allowing for stronger muscles and more efficient movement. The framework for all future vertebrates was being perfected in these waters. The oxygen-rich conditions of the Devonian encouraged growth. Bodies could be larger, muscles thicker, metabolisms faster. The ocean was learning how to sustain scale. Giant ammonites, relatives of modern squid and octopuses, drifted through open water in coiled shells the size of wagon wheels. Their tentacles trailed behind them as they floated effortlessly, rising and sinking with the rhythm of their gas-filled chambers. Smaller fish hid in their shadows for safety. Everything in the water had adapted to the giant's presence, some as prey, some as symbionts, some as scavengers that followed in their wake. Even the plants of the sea were changing. Algal mats grew into forests of early seaweeds, their fronds waving gently in the current. These underwater groves provided food and shelter, forming the first complex habitats in shallow waters. Life no longer existed in isolation. It existed in layers, top, middle, bottom, each layer feeding the others. The structure of modern marine ecosystems was fully established. For the first time, some fish began to explore beyond the safety of water. The transition was slow and uncertain. In swampy shallows where the air was heavy and the water warm, some species developed stronger fins capable of supporting their weight for brief moments on land. These were lobe-finned fish, ancestors of all future amphibians. Their lungs, originally adaptations for surviving in oxygen-poor water, allowed them to breathe air for short periods. Each movement onto the muddy shoreline was tentative, but it was enough. Life was beginning to look toward another frontier. The ocean had raised its giants, and now it was teaching them to walk. Still, most of the drama remained underwater. The reefs of the Devonian were alive with colour and danger. Corals grew in branching towers, forming mazes where predators hunted and prey hid. The light filtered through in ribbons, scattering across shells and scales. Crinoids, relatives of sea lilies, extended their feathery arms to catch drifting food. Trilobites, though past their prime, still scuttled across the seafloor in vast herds. The water was warm, the current steady, and life had never been more abundant. But abundance can bring vulnerability. The more intricate the ecosystem, the more fragile its balance becomes. Changes in climate, sea level, or chemistry could send ripples through the web of life. and in the late Devonian, the ocean began to change. Volcanic activity increased, releasing gases that altered the atmosphere. Oxygen levels fluctuated. Large regions of the sea became stagnant, deprived of circulation. Coral reefs began to die off, and with them the creatures that depended on them. The ocean that had nurtured giants was beginning to suffocate. For the great placoderms, this was catastrophic. Their size and armour, once advantages, became liabilities. Heavy bodies needed constant oxygen, and without it they faltered. Many species vanished within a few million years, victims of the same adaptations that had made them powerful. The giants fell, one by one, as the conditions that had favoured them collapsed. By the end of the Devonian, most of the great armoured fish were gone. Their reign had lasted tens of millions of years, but the ocean moves on without sentiment. The predators that followed would be faster, lighter, and built for endurance rather than defence. Yet even in extinction, the giants left their mark. The bones of fish that died in anoxic seas sank into the mud, forming layers of organic material that would, over time, become black shale, and much later, the fossil fuels that still power our civilization. The ocean had a way of turning even death into continuity. The giants that once ruled the water became part of the earth itself. Not all life suffered. As the great placoderms declined, new forms emerged to fill their place. Sharks diversified rapidly, their lighter bodies giving them an edge in depleted waters. Ray-finned fish, the ancestors of most modern species, began to dominate. Their flexible skeletons and efficient swimming made them adaptable to a wide range of environments. The balance of power shifted once again. Armour had given way to motion. The age of the giants had ended, but the ocean had learned the lesson of mobility. On land, meanwhile, plants had begun to spread, creating the first true forests. Their roots stabilised soil, their leaves pulled carbon dioxide from the air, and their presence changed the atmosphere again. Rain carried nutrients from these new forests into the sea, fueling plankton blooms that fed marine life. The connection between land and ocean, once minimal, became profound. The giants may have fallen, but their world continued to evolve, intertwined with everything above and below. When we look at fossils from the Devonian today, we see more than bones. We see an entire philosophy of life written in structure, the constant balance between power and fragility, between defense and flexibility. The giants didn't fail, they completed their role. They demonstrated how far evolution could push size and strength before nature demanded adaptation once again. Each extinction in the ocean's history clears space for innovation, and the Devonian giants, for all their dominance, were no exception. If you imagine yourself drifting through that ocean just before the decline, the view would still be magnificent. The water would glow softly in the filtered light, schools of armoured fish moving like glinting metal beneath the surface. Ammonites would spiral upward, their shells catching flashes of colour. Sharks would glide just beyond visibility, their outlines cutting through the haze. Below, the coral forest would stretch endlessly, alive with motion. Everything would seem permanent, and yet it was already changing. The ocean has always been a paradox, eternal in rhythm, temporary in form. The giants taught the sea its own limitations. They tested how large a creature could grow, how strong armour could become, how long ecosystems could sustain complexity before resetting. And when their time ended, the ocean didn't mourn, it adapted. The next great age would belong to descendants of those early explorers, creatures that would take the lessons of the sea onto land, and others that would remain, refining speed and awareness rather than size and shell. The story of life had shifted again, as it always does. What remained was the legacy of scale. The ocean had proven it could sustain giants, and it would do so again in different forms, reptiles, whales, and other titans still to come. But this first generation, these armoured monarchs of the Devonian, were the original test. They were the blueprint of what the ocean could hold. Every great creature that followed, every predator, every whale, every shark, owes something to them, The shape of power itself was written in their bodies. When you stand beside the sea today and watch waves roll towards shore, it's easy to forget how ancient that rhythm is. Those same tides once moved through the gills of Dunkleosteus, across the shells of ammonites, through forests of coral that no longer exist. The water remembers. Every particle, every current carries memory forward. The giants are gone, but their pulse still moves through the ocean's breath. And as the tide shifted and the Devonian gave way to what would follow, the story didn't end. It simply changed scale. The armoured titans sank, but the ocean was already preparing for its next transformation. The creatures that had ruled the deep would give rise to others that could leave it. Fins would become limbs, gills would adapt to air, and the ocean, patient as ever, would watch its children climb onto land while keeping part of itself within them. The giants of the water would give birth to the explorers of the shore. The sea, though, would never be empty. New hunters and builders were already evolving in the depths. The cycle would continue as it always had. One wave replacing another, one age shaping the next. The titans had come and gone, but the story of the ocean was far from finished. When the ocean finished shaping its giants, it turned its attention to something smaller, something more deliberate. For hundreds of millions of years, life had existed in water alone. The sea was everything: sky, soil, home, and grave. But evolution is restless. It doesn't stay still when conditions shift. The Devonian oceans had reached their peak of diversity, yet the very abundance that filled them also made competition fierce. Resources near the coastlines grew scarce, predators ruled every corner of the reef, and oxygen levels in some shallows began to fluctuate. In that pressure, a few creatures began to look beyond the surface, not with curiosity but necessity. The ocean was teaching its inhabitants to walk. It didn't happen suddenly, and it didn't happen with intent. There were no plans or ambitions. It began with the fish that lived in the quiet shallows, where the water was warm and still, often muddy, where oxygen was low, and survival depended on innovation. These fish had fleshy, lobed fins, strong muscular appendages supported by internal bones rather than thin rays. They could push against the soft substrate, prop themselves up, and navigate the tangled roots of ancient plants that had begun to colonize the edges of the water. In time, these fins would become limbs, and these fins' bearers would become the first vertebrates to step onto land. Before that transformation, the world above the water was barren compared to the ocean. The land was green but quiet, covered mostly in low plants and early forests of ferns and club mosses. There were no insects buzzing, no birds calling, no mammals moving through the underbrush. The air was thick with moisture and carbon dioxide, the ground soft and damp. To the fish below, it must have looked like an alien landscape, motionless, colour without movement. Yet it held potential. Insects were just beginning to appear. Plants were spreading faster than before. There was food, there was space, and above all there was safety from the predators of the deep. Evolution doesn't need imagination, it only needs opportunity. The ocean's children found it in the shallows and started their slow migration toward the unfamiliar world above. The first steps weren't graceful. Early amphibians such as Tiktaalik and Acanthostega were still fish in most respects. They had gills, fins, scales, and tails for swimming. But they also had features that hinted at something new. Tiktaalik's fins contained bones arranged in a pattern strikingly similar to the limbs of later animals. One large bone connected to two smaller ones, ending in a cluster that would eventually become fingers. Its head could move independently from its body, a crucial adaptation for breathing and hunting in shallow water. It could lift itself on its fins and push through mudflats, or breathe air when oxygen in the water dropped too low. Evolution had not invented legs in one leap. It had modified fins that already existed, turning one world's solution into another's beginning. The ocean itself had set the stage for this change. Periods of drought and flooding created unstable environments in the shallows. Fish stranded in receding pools had to survive until the next rain or find new water. Those with the ability to gulp air or drag themselves short distances had a better chance of living long enough to reproduce. Over countless generations, these small advantages accumulated until the boundary between sea and land was no longer impassable. The fish that had once swum through coral forests now rested on muddy banks, blinking at a world they were never meant to inhabit. But the move was not easy. The physics of life on land were different. Water supports weight effortlessly, air does not. Muscles and bones that had been designed to resist drag now had to resist gravity. Gills collapsed when exposed to air, forcing the evolution of lungs capable of drawing oxygen directly from the atmosphere. Skin that had once been permeable to water had to become resistant to drying out. Every step toward land was a negotiation between two worlds, one that offered stability and familiarity, and another that promised opportunity at a cost. For millions of years, creatures moved back and forth across that border. Some ventured out only to bask or escape predators, returning to the water for safety. Others laid eggs in the shallows, keeping their young protected in a halfway environment. Gradually the divide blurred. Evolution doesn't recognize boundaries, it only follows gradients. The coastline became a living laboratory, and every tide brought another experiment. The plants that had spread across the continents also played their part. Their roots broke down rocks, creating soil rich in nutrients. When rain washed these minerals into the sea, it fertilized coastal waters, creating new feeding grounds for the amphibious pioneers. The connection between land and ocean deepened. Each shaped the other's destiny. The first forests stabilized the air, raised oxygen levels, and offered shade and shelter for the creatures that would soon crawl beneath them. Life was weaving the planet into one continuous ecosystem. If you could stand on the edge of a Devonian swamp and watch one of these early amphibians emerge, it would look both familiar and alien. The body would still resemble a fish, long, flattened, with a tail for swimming, but the movement would be slow and deliberate. Fins pressing against mud, the head lifting briefly to gulp air. It might rest, eyes barely above the surface, sensing vibrations through the ground. It wouldn't stay long. Its skin needed moisture, and its muscles were still built for water. But each visit would last a little longer, each generation a little stronger. The sea was testing how far it could reach. The creatures that remained fully aquatic also evolved alongside these pioneers. Sharks diversified into new forms, some built for open ocean speed, others for lurking in the depths. The reefs recovered in new shapes after earlier collapses, hosting a balance of old and new species. The oceans were still powerful, still dominant, but something fundamental had shifted. The monopoly of water was ending. For the first time, the ocean was sharing its legacy with the land. The journey from water to land also brought new challenges of perception. In the dense medium of water, sound travels faster and farther, but light scatters quickly. On land, it was the opposite. Vision became sharper, and hearing became more complex. The early amphibians that ventured out had to adjust their senses to an entirely new environment. Some evolved eyelids to keep their eyes moist, others developed stronger tongues to catch prey. Bit by bit, the body reorganized itself to match its new surroundings. The sea had provided everything: food, shelter, buoyancy, but the land required independence. Evolution rewarded those who could adapt not just physically, but behaviourally. And yet, even as these new creatures took their first uncertain steps, they never completely left the ocean behind. Their bodies carried reminders of their origin: the salt in their blood, the structure of their bones, the rhythm of their breathing. The heartbeat of a terrestrial animal still follows the ancient pulse of the tides. Every cell still floats in a miniature ocean of fluid. The transition from sea to land wasn't a separation, it was a translation. The language of the ocean was rewritten for a new world, but the meaning stayed the same. The Devonian shoreline must have been a strange place. The air was thick and humid. filled with the scent of growing plants. Fern-like trees rose above swamps, their leaves casting dappled shadows on pools of water below. Insects the size of a hand crawled through the undergrowth, their wings still fragile experiments in flight. Amphibians lurked in the shallows, half hidden, their eyes scanning both worlds. The soundscape would have been quiet. No birds, no mammals, only the faint rustle of leaves and the splash of movement. It was the beginning of terrestrial life as we know it, but at the time it was simply evolution finding another rhythm. Back in the sea, the descendants of the giants continued to evolve. The fall of the great armoured fish had opened new spaces in the ecosystem, and lighter, more flexible species took their place. Coral reefs changed structure again, adapting to new water conditions. Some regions recovered quickly, others remained barren for millions of years. The ocean was learning to renew itself, a pattern it would repeat through every extinction and recovery that followed. Each time, life found a way to continue, often in forms more diverse than before. The creatures walking on land carried that same resilience with them. Their bones thickened, their limbs strengthened, their lungs grew larger. Over time, they began spending more of their lives out of water, feeding on insects and plants that grew near the edges. When danger came, they returned to the water for safety. They lived between worlds, neither fully aquatic nor fully terrestrial, yet perfectly adapted to both. It was a slow, delicate balance, one that would eventually tip toward land but never entirely leave the sea behind. The movement onto land also changed the ocean itself. The plants that now blanketed the continents drew carbon dioxide from the air, cooling the planet and altering rainfall patterns. Rivers carved new channels, carrying sediment into the sea. The chemistry of the water shifted again, affecting coral growth, nutrient flow, and oxygen levels. The ocean and the land had become partners in evolution. Each responded to the other's changes, and together they shaped the future. Over millions of years, the descendants of those first walkers spread across the continents. They evolved into a variety of forms, some small and agile, others large and slow. But even as terrestrial ecosystems developed, the ocean remained the planet's anchor. The majority of life still lived within it, and everything that happened on land eventually returned to it through rivers, erosion, and the endless cycle of water. The planet had become one continuous system of movement and exchange. Every step taken on land was an extension of the ocean's reach. The animals that walked, the plants that grew, the rain that fell, all of it began as part of the sea's experiment with possibility. When you look at a landscape today, with its trees, rivers, and animals, you are seeing the ocean in another form. The water that once carried armoured fish now flows through soil and clouds. The chemistry of the deep has become the chemistry of life itself. It's easy to think of the march to land as a story of departure, as if the ocean lost something when its creatures left. But it wasn't loss, it was expansion. The sea didn't surrender its dominance, it extended it. Every animal that breathes air carries the ocean within. Every raindrop that falls began as vapour from the waves. The connection was never broken, it only changed shape. In the millions of years that followed, the descendants of those first pioneers would evolve into creatures that could live entirely without returning to the water. Reptiles would emerge, laying eggs that didn't dry out. Insects would fill the skies, and forests would grow taller. The land would become alive with sound and motion. But it all began with that quiet moment in the Devonian shallows, when a fish lifted itself just enough to see the world above the surface. The act seemed small, almost insignificant, yet from it an entire branch of life unfolded. The ocean, in its patience, allowed it to happen. It didn't close itself off when its creations wandered away. It continued to nurture, to breathe, to evolve. The tide still reached inland, carrying nutrients to coastal forests. The rain still fell, returning minerals to the sea. The conversation between land and ocean never ended. It simply found new languages in rivers, clouds, and roots. If you stand at a shoreline today, you're looking at that ancient boundary, the same one crossed by the first animals that dared to crawl out of the water. The waves that touch your feet are part of a lineage billions of years old. Every motion of the tide, every shift of sand beneath the surface, is part of that ongoing dialogue between what once was and what continues to be. The ocean learned to walk, and in doing so it ensured that life would never be confined again. From the smallest amphibian to the largest mammal, from forests to cities, everything that moves across land carries the ocean's history inside it. The sea didn't stop creating, it simply changed its horizon, and while its creatures explored new worlds, it remained behind, steady and vast, preparing for its next transformation. For even as the land grew forests and the sky filled with wings, the ocean was already shaping another generation of giants, ones that would return to the water and reclaim it in forms more graceful, more powerful, and more immense than anything the Devonian had ever known. When the march to land reached its stride, the world began to look entirely different. Forests spread across the continents, rivers cut through valleys, and air-breathing creatures filled the land with sound. For a while, it seemed that life had turned its attention completely away from the sea. The ocean, however, never ceased evolving. It simply waited. Every great migration leaves something behind, and in the silence that followed, the water began to reclaim what it had once given away. The descendants of the land's first rulers would soon return to the waves, reshaped by time and necessity. The age of fish and amphibians had ended, but the age of reptiles, and with it, a new empire of the sea, was about to begin. The planet had entered the Mesozoic era. On land, dinosaurs ruled. In the skies, pterosaurs drifted like living kites. But beneath the waves, an entirely different reign unfolded. The oceans of the Triassic and Jurassic periods became laboratories for adaptation. Reptiles that once walked the land began to take to the water again, discovering in it the same abundance and opportunity that had drawn their ancestors millions of years before. The result was a world of giants, sleek, powerful, and unlike anything the ocean had seen since the fall of the armoured fish. It began slowly, as always. Some reptiles returned to the coastlines to feed, hunting fish in the shallows. Their limbs flattened into paddles, their bodies became streamlined, and their lungs adapted for long dives. Over time, those that lingered in the water evolved into new forms entirely. The ichthyosaurs were among the first. Their transformation was astonishing. Land-dwelling reptiles reshaped by evolution into creatures that looked more like dolphins than lizards. They were built for speed, their bodies curved and tapered, their tails crescent-shaped for propulsion. With large eyes adapted for dim light, they hunted deep beneath the surface, chasing squid and fish through the ancient blue. The ichthyosaurs were masters of the open ocean. Some reached lengths of 15 meters, among the largest predators of their time. They gave birth to live young rather than laying eggs, a sign of their complete adaptation to marine life. Their skin was smooth, their movements effortless, their presence unmistakable. Fossilized remains of pregnant ichthyosaurs show embryos arranged headfirst in the womb, ready to emerge into water, proof that these reptiles had fully surrendered to the sea. While the ichthyosaurs ruled the deeper waters, other reptiles claimed the coasts and shallows. The plesiosaurs appeared next, with long necks and small heads balanced on broad, powerful bodies. Their limbs had become 4 massive flippers, allowing them to glide through the water in graceful, sweeping motions. Some species had necks so long they could move them like serpents, striking at prey while the rest of their bodies remained motionless. Others evolved shorter necks and larger heads, built for crushing shells or seizing fast-moving fish. Each design was a different solution to the same question: how to thrive in a world where survival belonged to those who moved best through water. The ocean during this age was vast and warm. The continents had begun to drift apart, creating new seas and coastlines. Currents shifted, bringing nutrients from the deep to the surface, feeding plankton blooms that filled the water with life. Coral reefs flourished again after their long absence, hosting swarms of fish and invertebrates. The surface teemed with ammonites, spiral-shelled cephalopods that floated and drifted by the millions. The delicate shells reflected the sunlight, turning the ocean into a shimmering mosaic of motion, and among them swam the new predators, their shadows cutting through the light like blades. Mosasaurus appeared later, near the end of the Cretaceous, but its story began here, with smaller lizards adapting to the water in stages, their limbs elongating into flippers, their tails strengthening for propulsion. The largest mosasaurs would eventually rival whales in size, their jaws packed with teeth designed for gripping slippery prey. They were apex hunters, the final heirs of the reptilian ocean empires before the age of mammals began, but long before they appeared, the Jurassic seas already belonged to the reptiles. If you could swim through those waters, you'd see a world both alien and familiar. Schools of fish darted through forests of coral, their scales reflecting sunlight in brief flashes. Sea urchins crept across the sand, starfish clung to rocks, and early crustaceans scuttled through crevices. Above them, the plesiosaurs glided like shadows, their long necks weaving through schools of prey. The ichthyosaurs darted past, sleek and silent, their eyes catching the faintest glint of movement. And far below, in the dim blue of the deep, ammonites drifted like lanterns, their shells glimmering in slow motion. The ocean was alive with structure again, predator and prey, hunter and scavenger, builder and destroyer, all part of a balance that had taken eons to refine. For the reptiles, returning to the sea meant more than changing shape. It required an entirely new way of life. They had to control their body temperature in water that shifted between warm and cold. They had to evolve new ways to breathe and manage salt intake. Some developed specialized glands to expel excess salt. Others adjusted their metabolism to conserve oxygen. Every adaptation carried the memory of their terrestrial past, repurposed for a new world. They were not fish, but something in between. Air-breathing creatures that lived entirely underwater, still bound to the surface by the need to inhale, yet perfectly suited to the deep. The dominance of reptiles reshaped the ecosystem. Their size and power drove evolutionary pressure on everything around them. Fish grew faster and more agile. Cephalopods developed more advanced propulsion and camouflage. Some marine animals began to burrow deeper or live in shells too thick to crack. The sea had entered another arms race, this time between speed and stealth, size and intelligence. Every advance by one group forced a countermeasure in another. The rhythm of adaptation quickened. Above the water, the climate was changing. The Jurassic world was warm, humid and rich in vegetation. The land fed nutrients into the ocean through rivers, fueling blooms of life that stretched across entire coastlines. Vast inland seas formed, creating shallow environments perfect for marine reptiles to hunt and breed. In these calm waters, young ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs learned to swim, their movements guided by instincts carried from ancestors that had once walked on land. Life had found stability in motion. The balance, however, was never permanent. Throughout the Mesozoic, fluctuations in sea level periodically reshaped coastlines. When oceans rose, reefs and shallow basins expanded. When they fell, entire ecosystems were left stranded. Extinctions came and went, some local, some global. Each time, life adapted, rebuilding the web from what remained. The ocean's resilience was absolute, its capacity to reinvent itself unmatched. The reptiles thrived through these changes for over 150 million years. Their dominance spanned longer than the time separating humanity from the last ice age. They became the embodiment of what the ocean could achieve when evolution was given time and abundance. Some ichthyosaurs grew so streamlined that their bodies were nearly indistinguishable from modern dolphins. They even gave birth tail first, just as whales do, an adaptation to prevent newborns from drowning during delivery. Their lives mirrored those of the mammals that would one day replace them, as if the ocean was rehearsing its future. The reefs, too, reached extraordinary complexity. Coral structures towered like underwater cities, their inhabitants as diverse as any terrestrial forest. Every surface was occupied. Crabs cleaning algae, fish hiding among branches, mollusks filtering the current. The sound of a reef, if translated into air, would be a continuous murmur of clicks, snaps, and vibrations. Life pulsed through every inch of it, and hovering nearby, the reptilian giants passed through like living storms, momentarily disturbing but never destroying the balance. The ichthyosaurs eventually reached their peak and began to fade. Their decline remains mysterious. Some scientists think competition from new predators, such as the plesiosaurs and early mosasaurs, drove them out. Others point to changing ocean temperatures or food shortages. Whatever the cause, their disappearance opened space for other reptiles to rise. Plesiosaurs diversified into even stranger forms, some short-necked and powerful, others long-necked and elegant, their flippers beating in a rhythm that looked almost like flight. For a time, they were the ocean's undisputed rulers. Fossils show bite marks on their bones from fights with others of their kind, evidence that they competed as fiercely with each other as they did with prey. Some carried embryos within them, proving they too gave birth to live young. The ocean had fully become a reptilian world, one where land dwellers had transformed into masters of buoyancy, grace, and patience. When the Cretaceous period arrived, the ocean changed again. The continents continued to drift, opening wide new seas and narrowing others. The Atlantic began to form, dividing ecosystems and isolating species. In these vast new waters, mosasaurs emerged, the last and perhaps most formidable of the marine reptiles. Their long muscular bodies and powerful tails made them fast and efficient predators. They could open their jaws wide enough to swallow prey whole, and their double-hinged skulls allowed them to consume animals nearly as large as themselves. They hunted anything that moved: fish, turtles, other reptiles. Their reign was short compared to that of the ichthyosaurs, but it was absolute. The ocean during this time was a place of giants within giants. The mosasaurs hunted ammonites the size of car tyres, while sharks the length of small boats fed on their leftovers. The water was warm and nutrient-rich, and every level of the food chain was filled. The world had reached a kind of biological equilibrium, vast, dangerous, and stable. But like every era before it, this one was temporary. The same cycles that had raised the reptiles would eventually bring them down. Volcanic activity, shifting continents, and climate change all set the stage for the next great extinction. When the asteroid struck at the end of the Cretaceous, it didn't just end the age of dinosaurs on land. It ended the age of reptiles in the sea. The great mosasaurs and plesiosaurs vanished almost overnight, their bodies sinking to the depths they once ruled. The ocean went quiet again, its surface reflecting a sky filled with ash. What followed was not emptiness but waiting. The planet recovered, as it always did. The waters cleared, the temperature stabilized, and life began to return. The reefs rebuilt, fish diversified, and somewhere among the small surviving creatures, those with lungs and warm blood, evolution began another slow experiment. The mammals, which had lived in the shadows for so long, began to adapt to the ocean. They would take everything the reptiles had learned, breathing, diving, birthing in water, and refine it further. The ocean was ready for its next rulers. Still, the legacy of the reptiles endures. Every dolphin's shape, every whale's motion, every air-breathing creature of the sea carries traces of their design. The ocean remembers its experiments. The ichthyosaur's speed, the plesiosaur's elegance, the mosasaur's ferocity, all of it remains, encoded in the logic of evolution. When you see a modern whale breach or a sea turtle glide beneath the waves, you're witnessing echoes of that ancient reign, when reptiles ruled the blue world. The ocean doesn't cling to its past, but it never erases it either. Each age leaves behind fragments, shells, bones, chemical signatures in stone that tell the story of what once lived and how it moved. The Jurassic blue was more than a colour or a time. It was a living system of innovation, proof that the sea never stops reshaping life to fit its vast shifting design. The reptiles had come, conquered and fallen, but the ocean's rhythm continued. It was already preparing to fill the silence with new voices, the songs of creatures yet to be born, whose breath would carry the same air the ichthyosaurs once drew, and whose hearts would beat to the same ancient pulse of the tide. The waves, unchanged through all of it, kept moving. The ocean didn't mourn its fallen kings, it simply turned the page, and in the stillness that followed, the first sounds of something new, something warm-blooded and intelligent, began to stir beneath the surface, ready to inherit what the giants had left behind. After the rise of the great marine reptiles, the ocean entered a period of deceptive calm. The Jurassic seas had been fast and vibrant, full of new shapes and energy, but the Cretaceous deep was different. It was heavier, slower and quieter, yet no less dangerous. The creatures that lived within it moved with precision, their power concealed beneath layers of stillness. The giants of this age were predators built for patience, their strength not in speed alone but in control. Every movement deliberate, every motion calculated. This was a world where time itself seemed to slow, where survival depended on the art of waiting. By the beginning of the Cretaceous, the planet's continents had drifted farther apart, opening vast new oceans between them. The Tethys Sea stretched across the equator, a warm, shallow expanse filled with reefs and life. The Atlantic was young but growing, its waters mixing with the deep currents of the south. Sea levels were high, flooding much of the land and turning continents into archipelagos. From above, Earth looked more blue than ever. The planet was at its warmest in millions of years, with no polar ice and tropical conditions extending far toward the poles. The ocean thrived under that warmth, its ecosystems complex and crowded. The great marine reptiles that had ruled the Jurassic survived the transition but not unchanged. Ichthyosaurs, once dominant, were declining. Their streamlined bodies, once unmatched, faced competition from newer hunters that occupied the same ecological space. Plesiosaurs diversified into two main designs: long-necked, small-headed species that grazed on fish and squid, and short-necked, large-headed versions that became the top predators of the shallows. But the most formidable of all were the mosasaurs. Mosasaurus and its relatives emerged from lizards that had once lived near the coast. Over time, these reptiles adapted completely to life at sea. Their bodies lengthened, their limbs transformed into flippers, and their tails evolved into powerful, sweeping structures that propelled them through the water with silent strength. Some species grew over 15 meters long. They were not fast in the sense of bursts and chases. They were steady, precise, relentless. A mosasaur could cruise for hours, conserving energy, rising to the surface only to breathe before sinking again into the dim depths. When it struck, it did so with terrifying accuracy. The head of a large mosasaur was a masterpiece of engineering. Double-jointed jaws capable of opening wide enough to swallow large prey whole, teeth curved and serrated for gripping slippery bodies, and muscles strong enough to crush bone. Their bite wasn't the fastest, but it was one of the most controlled in prehistory. They didn't rely on sudden speed, they relied on inevitability. Once a mosasaur decided to kill, escape was unlikely. These reptiles dominated nearly every marine environment. In shallow coastal seas, smaller species hunted schools of fish, their bodies twisting like eels as they struck. In deeper waters, the giants preyed on turtles, sharks, and even other mosasaurs. Fossils show evidence of battles, tooth marks on bones, healed wounds, broken ribs, proof that their dominance was not uncontested. They fought, fed, and scavenged within the same spaces, maintaining a hierarchy defined not by species but by size and experience. Around them, the ocean pulsed with other life. Ammonites drifted in vast, slow-moving clouds, their shells lined with intricate patterns that helped them control buoyancy. They were everywhere, their spiral forms ranging from tiny to enormous, serving as both hunters and prey. Belemnites, relatives of modern squid, darted through the water in bursts of motion, their bullet-shaped bodies leaving faint trails of ink. Crustaceans dug into the sand, building burrows that turned the seafloor into a living maze. Above, rays and primitive sharks glided in lazy circles, waiting for smaller fish to stray too far from safety. The surface waters, bright and shallow, belonged to plankton and algae. Their blooms fed the entire system, creating the base of the food web that supported the giants. The sunlight that filtered through the waves carried the energy that would one day power predators the size of buses. Every movement, every hunt, every death was connected to that simple act of photosynthesis near the surface. The ocean, even at its most violent, was still governed by light. In the deeper zones, where sunlight faded to blue and green, life slowed. Here, the predators of the Cretaceous moved like ghosts. Mosasaurs patrolled silently, their silhouettes gliding through the dim water. The pressure was immense, but they were built for it. Lungs that could hold air for long dives, muscles that worked efficiently even with little oxygen. When they surfaced, it was brief and quiet, the water breaking for only a moment before closing behind them. Unlike their land-bound relatives, they made no sound, no roar. Their dominance was expressed in silence. The reefs during this time were complex cities of colour and geometry. Corals, sponges and algae competed for space, forming intricate towers and labyrinths. Small fish wove through the coral branches, each movement synchronized with the others. Larger predators passed overhead, their shadows darkening the reef for a moment before moving on. The life here existed in perpetual motion, yet it felt unhurried. Even the predators moved as though aware that the ocean rewarded patience more than speed. The Cretaceous deep was not empty of danger beyond reptiles. Sharks, though smaller than their modern descendants, were growing more efficient. Species like Cretoxorina, a massive cousin of the great white, ruled the mid-level waters. It could reach nearly 7 meters in length and had jaws lined with sharp triangular teeth that cut through flesh cleanly. Unlike the reptiles, sharks never needed to surface for air. They could wait longer, dive deeper, and circle endlessly. The competition between them and the mosasaurs must have been constant. 2 predators built on different designs, one reptilian and air-breathing, the other fish-like and tireless. Each tested the limits of the other. In this age of predators, defense took new forms. Turtles grew thicker shells. Some fish developed bony plates under their skin. Squid and ammonites relied on ink clouds or swift escape. Even small crustaceans evolved spines or burrowing behaviours. The ocean was an unending contest between innovation and endurance. Every creature carried its own version of armour or stealth, its own method for surviving just one more tide. Above the surface, the world was equally alive. Dinosaurs roamed forests of cycads and ferns, and pterosaurs hunted fish from the air. Some of those fish would be snatched mid-leap by waiting reptiles, closing the circle between sea and sky. The boundaries between environments were blurred. The ocean was never separate from the rest of life. It was an extension of the same system that fed and shaped the continents. The water cycle that began in the sea still governed everything that lived on land. Rain fell, rivers carried minerals back to the ocean, and the balance continued as it had for billions of years. The slowness of the Cretaceous deep wasn't laziness, it was efficiency. The creatures that ruled it had learned that energy was precious in a world where food could vanish without warning. They moved only when necessary, conserving their strength until the moment it mattered. The stillness of a mosasaur drifting through dark water wasn't idleness. it was calculation. Every motion was an equation solved perfectly, without waste. The deep itself changed the creatures that lived within it. Pressure and darkness rewarded those that could sense rather than see. Some fish developed lateral lines so sensitive they could detect the vibration of a single fin stroke meters away. Others evolved light-producing organs, creating the first bioluminescent displays, pulses and flashes that served as communication, camouflage, or lures. The ocean was teaching light to speak in the dark. At the same time, the chemical composition of the sea was subtly shifting. Volcanic activity released minerals and gases that changed the distribution of nutrients. Some regions became rich and teeming with life, while others turned barren and oxygen poor. Creatures that could migrate or tolerate both extremes flourished. Those that couldn't faded into the fossil record. The ocean, as always, rewarded flexibility. It's easy to imagine the Cretaceous ocean as chaotic, filled with constant violence, but the reality was slower, more deliberate. Most of the time, it was quiet. The reefs pulsed with gentle motion, plankton drifted in invisible clouds, and the giants glided through the blue like living shadows. The stillness wasn't absence, it was tension, the quiet between heartbeats, the moment before a predator struck. The power of the Cretaceous deep lay in its balance between peace and violence, between motion and stillness. When the end came, it came as it always did, without warning. The asteroid that struck Earth 66 million years ago didn't just end the reign of land dinosaurs, it darkened the skies, cooled the oceans and silenced the slow giants below. Photosynthesis stalled as sunlight was blocked by dust and ash. Plankton died, the base of the food chain collapsed, and the great predators starved. The seas that had once been full of slow, patient motion became still for reasons evolution couldn't anticipate. Yet even in extinction, the ocean was not empty. Some small species survived, fish, sharks, and tiny plankton that endured by feeding on detritus. In the darkness, life waited. When the light returned, it began again, rebuilding from what remained. The mosasaurs and ammonites were gone, but their disappearance opened the water for something new. Mammals, small and adaptable, began their slow return to the sea, inheriting the lessons of every creature that came before. The Cretaceous Deep was the ocean's final chapter before that transformation. It represented the height of reptilian dominance and the perfection of balance between predator and prey. It showed that power could exist without haste, that survival could depend on patience as much as aggression. The creatures of this time mastered the art of waiting, and that lesson would pass to their successors, to the whales, the sharks, the hunters that glide today beneath the same surface. If you stand by the sea now and watch its slow, deliberate motion, you're seeing the same rhythm that shaped the Cretaceous world. The water still moves at the same pace, still breathes with the same pulse. The silence between waves carries the memory of those ancient predators, the ones that moved like shadows and ruled without noise. The ocean doesn't forget. It only changes its form, passing its memory forward through each generation of life. What the Cretaceous Deep taught was endurance, the ability to hold still until the moment mattered. It's the same instinct that drives modern predators, from great white sharks to orcas, to wait before they strike. It's the same rhythm that beats through every living thing that calls the ocean home. The giants may have vanished, but their patience remains, written into the logic of the sea itself. And as the dust of extinction settled, the ocean exhaled once more, ready to begin another cycle. The reptiles were gone, but their legacy would not fade. It would be carried forward by creatures that breathed air, birthed live young, and sang beneath the waves. Descendants not in blood, but in spirit. The next rulers of the deep were waiting in the shallows, small, warm-blooded, and unassuming. The ocean had slowed to near silence, but beneath that quiet its next transformation was already stirring. When the light finally returned to Earth after the Great Impact, the ocean was not the same. The sky, once bright with the colour of sunlit haze, was a dull grey. Dust still hung in the air, and for years the sunlight reaching the surface was faint and cold. The waves moved, but without their old shimmer, carrying the weight of silence from coast to coast. The creatures that had ruled those waters, the mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, the great ammonites, were gone. The reefs were broken, the plankton nearly vanished, and the blue world had turned into a place of waiting. The aftermath of extinction is never immediate. It unfolds slowly, in layers, like the settling of sediment after a storm. For centuries, the ocean was a graveyard. Bones of giants sank through the water, coming to rest on the seafloor in drifts of calcium and carbon. Their shapes dissolved over time, leaving only impressions, the negative space of what once had been alive. Entire food webs had collapsed, leaving gaps where entire species had once linked the chain. Yet even in the absence of abundance, the machinery of life never stopped completely. Microbes endured, hidden in the mud and vents of the deep, feeding on the chemical traces of decay. The ocean's smallest inhabitants once again held the weight of the world. From the surface, the planet must have seemed still. The winds carried fine ash that dimmed the horizon, and rain fell acidic, washing minerals into the sea. The chemistry of the water changed. With less sunlight, photosynthesis slowed. Temperatures dropped, currents weakened, and the familiar balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide shifted. In some regions, the ocean turned stagnant, dark and oxygen poor, while others remained alive with small resilient species that found opportunity in emptiness. Life retreated, condensed, and adapted. For the organisms that survived, the extinction was both catastrophe and opportunity. With the great predators gone, entire ecosystems were left unclaimed. Sharks, small and efficient, became the top hunters again. Bony fish diversified rapidly, filling the gaps left by reptiles and ammonites. Crustaceans multiplied in the shallows, scavenging the remains of the dead. Evolution works fastest in aftermaths, in the spaces where competition disappears. The quiet following extinction is not an end, it's a pause before acceleration. It took thousands of years for sunlight to fully return to its old intensity, but when it did, the ocean responded almost instantly. Plankton bloomed in the newly brightened water, painting the surface in shifting colours. Their return fed zooplankton, which in turn fed fish, which fed the sharks. The web reassembled itself from the bottom up like a slow breath drawn after too long without air. The reefs began to grow again, first as small patches of coral clinging to bare rock, then as sprawling structures of colour and motion. The silence of extinction gave way to the sound of renewal. From the ruins of the reptilian world, new players emerged. Among them were the survivors of a lineage that had once been small and inconspicuous, the mammals. During the Mesozoic, they had lived in the shadows of giants, confined to forests and burrows. But when the dinosaurs vanished, they spread rapidly. Some returned to the sea, following the same ancient pattern that had guided the reptiles before them. It began with creatures that hunted along coasts, diving for fish and crustaceans. In time, their bodies changed. Legs became flippers, nostrils shifted backward to form blowholes, and lungs adapted for deep, efficient dives. These returning mammals, the ancestors of whales, dolphins, and seals, were different from anything the ocean had seen. They carried warm blood, constant and reliable, allowing them to thrive even when temperatures fluctuated. They gave birth to live young and nursed them with milk. They breathed air, but they belonged entirely to the sea. Their bodies remembered the rhythm of waves. Their hearts beat in time with the pressure of tides. The ocean, after losing its reptilian kings, had found new rulers in the warmth of mammalian life. But that renewal was gradual, unfolding across millions of years. Before whales and dolphins filled the blue again, there were simpler stages. The ocean had to rebuild its architecture. The reefs, the currents, the cycles of nutrients. Corals spread along tropical shelves, reclaiming their old foundations. Algae and plankton multiplied, restoring oxygen to the surface waters. The seafloor, once covered in the remnants of death, became fertile again. The mineral-rich deposits from the extinction's decay fed the next wave of growth. Life was rebuilding itself from its own remains. Every species that survived carried a story of adaptation. Some fish developed more efficient gills to cope with low oxygen. Others evolved stronger jaws to handle the new kinds of prey that filled the void. Sharks, the eternal opportunists of the ocean, diversified into hundreds of forms. They filled every niche, from small scavengers to large hunters. Their resilience, unchanged since the Devonian, allowed them to thrive when more specialized creatures could not. In the quiet after extinction, simplicity became strength. The Earth's climate stabilized slowly. Volcanoes continued to shape the atmosphere, but over time, the dust settled, the temperature rose, and the greenhouse effect balanced again. The warmth returned, and with it, the circulation of the ocean's layers. Currents once more carried nutrients from the deep to the surface, feeding plankton blooms that stretched for miles. The rhythm of life resumed, familiar yet altered, like a song remembered differently after silence. The Cretaceous had ended violently, but the recovery that followed was the beginning of the modern ocean. Many of the creatures we recognise today trace their ancestry to this renewal. The first true coral reefs of the modern type appeared during this time, built by the same kinds of stony corals that dominate tropical waters now. Crabs, lobsters, and bony fish diversified into recognisable forms. The sea was no longer a prehistoric expanse of monsters and titans. It was becoming a balanced, interconnected world much closer to our own. The extinction had also redrawn the map of evolution itself. Before it, reptiles had been the ocean's engineers. After it, mammals would become the architects. But their rise would not have been possible without the interval of stillness that followed the impact. Extinction clears not only species but expectations. It resets the possibilities. In that clearing, evolution began to experiment again. Slower this time, more deliberate, as if cautious of repeating its old excess. The atmosphere thickened with oxygen once more, and weather patterns stabilized. Rain carried minerals from the recovering forests into the sea, fertilizing the coastal shallows. The continents continued to drift, changing currents and creating new migration routes. The Atlantic widened, the Pacific deepened, and entire ecosystems formed in places that had once been empty. The ocean was larger than ever, and life expanded to fill it. It's tempting to imagine extinction as a single, devastating event, but in truth it is a long negotiation between destruction and adaptation. The great dying of the Cretaceous didn't end in a moment of silence. It ended in the slow rise of new sounds, the first cries of mammals on land, the soft swish of fins beneath the recovering sea, the pulse of currents carrying new life into old depths. Even in its darkest ages, the ocean never stopped breathing. The fossils from this period show both devastation and resilience. Layers of ash and iridium mark the impact, but above them, new shells and skeletons appear, smaller at first, then larger and more diverse. Every layer of sediment tells the same story repeated across ages. Life falls, waits, and rises again. The pattern is as old as the ocean itself. In the newly brightened seas, coral polyps built skeletons of calcium carbonate just as their ancestors had done billions of years earlier. Schools of fish returned to the reefs, feeding on the plankton that swirled through the sunlit shallows. Even the deep ocean, once choked with decay, became home again to slow, drifting creatures adapted to low light and high pressure. The planet was alive once more, though it carried the memory of loss in every grain of sediment. What's remarkable about this period is how little time the Earth needed to recover. In geological terms, the rebuilding was swift. Within a few million years, biodiversity had returned to nearly pre-extinction levels. The ocean doesn't forget, but it doesn't dwell. It absorbs change, transforms it, and moves forward. Its power lies not in preservation, but in reinvention. The mammals that eventually returned to the sea carried that same lesson. They evolved from creatures that had once hidden on land into beings that could dive hundreds of meters, communicate across vast distances, and navigate using sound instead of sight. Their warmth allowed them to survive in cold waters. Their intelligence helped them cooperate and adapt. They didn't replace the reptiles so much as inherit their role, refined through new understanding. The ocean had learned from its own history and passed that knowledge on through evolution's quiet language. The quiet aftermath of the extinction was more than recovery. It was reflection. The ocean doesn't hurry. It rebuilds with purpose, adjusting its chemistry, its climate, its balance. Each new era emerges from the last, shaped by what survived and what was lost. The silence after the Cretaceous wasn't emptiness. It was the ocean thinking, resetting, breathing before its next creation. If you could stand on a shoreline then, millions of years after the impact, you would see a world both familiar and alien. The air would be clear again, the water bright blue, the reefs alive with colour. Small fish would dart between coral branches, crabs would patrol the sand, and above it all the sky would be quiet, heavy with heat. The great reptiles would be gone, their bones buried deep beneath new layers of life. Yet the energy of their age, the pulse of power that had defined them, would still hum faintly beneath the surface. Nothing in nature truly vanishes, it only transforms. From that silence came everything that followed. Whales, dolphins, seals, seabirds, coral reefs, modern fish, even the balance of the climate itself. The extinction had rewritten the script of the ocean, creating space for new voices to emerge. The sea had once again turned loss into opportunity, death into renewal. Every great change in Earth's history carries this rhythm, the rise, the fall, the stillness, and the return. The ocean endures all of it without resistance. It absorbs impacts, buries the old world, and waits patiently for the next to unfold. The quiet aftermath of the Cretaceous was not the end of anything. It was simply the deep breath before another age began. And as that breath deepened, the first faint songs began to echo through the water. Sounds not of reptiles or fish, but of mammals, their voices resonating across miles of open ocean. The world had changed again. The ocean was no longer ruled by armour or scale. It had given birth to intelligence and song, to warmth and memory. The slow renewal after extinction had become the foundation for something entirely new, something that would define the ocean for the rest of its history. The ocean that followed the Great Extinction was familiar in colour, but different in spirit. It had shed its age of reptiles and giants and entered a new rhythm, slower, deeper, quieter. The world that rose from that silence was closer to our own, its continents in recognisable shapes, its air breathable, its waters carrying the same chemical balance that sustains life today. The reefs gleamed again, the fish returned, and in the open seas something unexpected began to move. It was not armoured, not scaled in reptilian sheen, but soft, warm, and breathing the same air that filled the sky. The giants had come back, but they were different now. They were not echoes in the sense of ghosts fading into memory. They were continuations, carrying forward what the ocean had learned over billions of years. The mammals that returned to the sea did so slowly, and the transition was not a single path but many. Some became seals, living between land and water. Some became manatees, drifting gently through shallow bays. But others went fully back to the deep, abandoning land altogether. Their ancestors had once walked on four legs, hunted along coasts, and looked toward the water as a place of food and danger. Over millions of years, that relationship reversed. The land became the stranger, and the ocean became home. The first of these fully aquatic mammals was small and tentative. but they carried within them the blueprint of the future. Lungs that could hold air for long dives, bones that could bend under pressure, muscles built for endless swimming. In time, they would become whales. The earliest whales, like Pachycetus and Ambulocetus, were still creatures of both worlds. They walked on shorelines, hunted in rivers, and used their limbs to paddle rather than propel. Their nostrils were still at the front of their snouts, their tails broad but not yet powerful. Evolution was experimenting, adjusting the design step by step. With each generation, the body became more suited to water. The hind limbs shrank, the forelimbs flattened into flippers, and the nostrils moved toward the top of the head to form a blowhole. The spine elongated, allowing graceful undulation through water. What had once been a predator on land had become an embodiment of movement, perfectly shaped for the ocean's rhythm. As whales grew larger, they began to occupy the roles once held by the reptiles of the past. Some hunted with power and speed, others filtered food through baleen plates, gathering plankton and small fish in massive quantities. The ocean had always favoured size when it could sustain it, and now that nutrients flowed freely again, it encouraged gigantism once more. The great baleen whales, descendants of small terrestrial mammals, grew into creatures longer than any reptile that had ever lived. Their existence was the ocean's quiet declaration that life would not only recover, but exceed what had come before. If you could drift beside one of these early giants in the open Cenozoic seas, the sound would be different from the silent motion of mosasaurs. There would be the low, resonant hum of breath breaking the surface, the pulse of water displaced by massive flippers, the distant echo of calls travelling through miles of water. The ocean had given voice to its new inhabitants. Whales communicated across vast distances, their songs carrying information, emotion, and perhaps memory. Where reptiles had ruled through force, mammals ruled through connection. The predators of the deep adapted in response. Sharks, which had survived every extinction since the Devonian, diversified again. Some remained small and fast, while others grew immense. The most famous, Carcharicles megalodon, appeared millions of years later and became one of the largest predators to ever exist. Reaching lengths of over 15 meters, it preyed on early whales, tearing through flesh with teeth the size of a human hand. The ocean had found balance again, the rise of giants matched by the rise of hunters capable of challenging them. But not all echoes of the past were predators. The ammonites were gone, but their descendants, squid and octopuses, continued their lineage in new forms. Intelligent, adaptable, and curious, they filled the oceans with motion and thought. Their ability to change colour and shape was a kind of silent conversation with the sea, an adaptation of communication that mirrored the whales' songs in a different language. Evolution had found new ways to express awareness beneath the surface. Every living creature in the modern ocean carries some piece of what came before. The bones of whales still reveal the remnants of hind limbs hidden deep within their bodies, a reminder of the time their ancestors walked on land. The shells of nautiluses still spiral in the same pattern as the ammonites that once drifted through the Cretaceous shallows. The rays that glide over coral reefs still move with the same rhythm as the placoderms that once dominated the Devonian seas. The connection is not metaphorical, it is literal, written into bone, tissue, and DNA. The ocean never starts over completely. It builds upon itself. In the shallows, coral reefs continue to serve as cradles of diversity, much as they have since the Cambrian. Fish dart between branches, using the same strategies of camouflage and schooling that their ancestors perfected 500 million years ago. Crustaceans clean and scavenge, recycling the endless flow of organic matter. Even the smallest plankton that drift near the surface perform the same role their predecessors did when oxygen first filled the atmosphere, feeding the web that sustains everything above. Every level of the modern ocean is a living museum, each species a chapter of a story still being written, and yet the echoes of the giants are not only in structure or survival, they are in behaviour, in presence, in the way life moves through water. The slow rise of a whale to breathe carries the same inevitability as the ascent of a plesiosaur surfacing millions of years ago. The stillness before a shark strikes mirrors the patience of a mosasaur waiting in the dark. The hum of sonar through deep water resonates with the same depth as the silence of the Cretaceous deep. The forms have changed, but the instincts remain. The ocean doesn't erase its memories, it repurposes them. Over the last few million years, the mammals of the deep have refined the ocean's language. Whales sing in frequencies that can travel hundreds of miles, using sound as navigation, mapping, and connection. Dolphins communicate with clicks and whistles, coordinating hunts and sharing social bonds. These sounds, layered and complex, have turned the ocean into a network of consciousness. It's no longer a world of blind survival. It's a world of awareness spread across distances too vast for vision. The quiet patience of ancient predators has become communication, cooperation, and even play. The sea, once ruled by armour and muscle, now hums with intelligence. The legacy of the giants is not only in size, but in persistence. The blue whale, the largest creature ever to live, is both a continuation and a culmination of everything the ocean has ever attempted. Its heart weighs as much as a small car, its tongue heavier than an elephant, yet it moves with grace, feeding on organisms smaller than a fingernail. Its existence defies the logic of efficiency, and yet defines it. The ocean's capacity to sustain such a creature is proof of how perfectly balanced its systems have become since the chaos of extinction. The blue whale is not an accident of scale. It is the ocean remembering what it can hold. Beneath the whales, in the midwater columns, the dance of light continues. Bioluminescent organisms flicker in slow cascades, their bodies carrying the same chemical pathways that first evolved in the depths hundreds of millions of years ago. Some produce flashes to confuse predators, others use steady glows to attract mates or signal safety. The ocean, even in darkness, is never silent. Every flicker of light, every vibration, every pulse of movement is part of the same long conversation that began before land even existed, and still the giants of the past linger, not in flesh, but in influence. The shapes of modern life are reminders of what worked, what endured, what returned. The great white shark carries the form perfected by its ancestors in the Cretaceous. The turtle's shell echoes the armour of the Devonian fish. The streamlined form of dolphins repeats the design of ichthyosaurs. Evolution rarely invents something new when the old still serves. It modifies, refines, and continues. In that sense, the ghosts of the giants are everywhere, not haunting, but guiding. If you were to follow a whale on its migration, you would see this continuity unfold across thousands of miles. It would pass over trenches filled with the bones of extinct reptiles, above reefs rebuilt countless times, through currents shaped by continents long gone. Its journey is both present and ancient, a movement through time as much as through space. The whale may not know this, but the water does. The currents that guide it are the same that once carried ammonites, trilobites, and armoured fish. The ocean doesn't forget its pathways. In the Arctic, seals rest on ice that drifts over waters where ichthyosaurs once swam. In the Pacific, sharks patrol the same migratory routes that mosasaurs might have followed. In the shallow bays of Australia, the descendants of ancient crustaceans still burrow into sediment unchanged in 500 million years. Everywhere you look, the modern ocean overlaps the ancient one. The boundaries between then and now dissolve beneath the waves. Even the chemistry of seawater carries memory. The ratio of salts, the balance of calcium and magnesium, the concentration of carbon dioxide, all shaped by eons of life building and dissolving shells, exhaling gases and breaking down rock. When you taste the ocean, you're tasting the accumulation of every organism that has ever lived within it. The ghosts of the giants are not metaphors, they are molecular. What the modern sea reveals, if you look closely, is not a world of replacement but of continuation. Every extinction, every collapse, every silence has been followed by renewal, but never from nothing. The new world always grows from the remnants of the old. The whales are not just the successors of reptiles, they are the fulfillment of a pattern that began when the first fish learned to breathe air. The same rhythm moves through everything that swims, crawls, or drifts beneath the surface. The forms change, but the song remains. The difference now is us. For the first time, there is a species on land that can look into the ocean and recognize those echoes consciously. We can find the bones of the giants buried in stone, trace their DNA in living creatures, and understand that what we see today is not separate from what once was. When we watch a whale surface or a shark glide beneath a reef, we are witnessing the living memory of a planet that has been practicing for billions of years. We are not apart from that story. We are its latest chapter, our own survival tied to the same cycles that govern the sea. Yet the modern ocean is changing again, and not in the slow, patient rhythm it prefers. The balance that took millions of years to refine is shifting in centuries. The same warmth that once allowed life to flourish is now rising too quickly. Currents are moving differently, corals are bleaching, and species are migrating toward cooler waters. The ocean, which has endured every extinction and recovery, now faces change from a single source, us. Its memory is long, but its tolerance is finite. Still, there is resilience. Even now, when stressed and strained, the ocean continues to rebuild. Corals spawn new colonies. Whales recover from centuries of hunting. Fish adapt their migrations to new temperatures. The ghosts of the giants remind us that life endures not by avoiding change, but by moving through it. The sea has lost more than we can imagine, yet it has never lost its ability to heal. The echoes in the modern sea are more than remnants of the past. They are reminders of what persistence means. Every breath a whale takes, every shimmer of plankton in the sunlight, every pulse of current through a coral reef carries the proof that extinction is never the end of life's conversation, only a pause. The ocean speaks through continuity, through memory held not in words but in motion. The giants of the past are gone, but their legacy moves still, in the muscles of a swimming shark, in the sound of distant waves, in the unbroken rhythm of the tides. If you listen closely, you can still hear it, not as a sound, but as a sense of scale, a weight of time stretching beyond comprehension. It's in the slow exhale of a surfacing whale, in the shimmer of sunlight beneath the surface, in the quiet persistence of coral building stone from nothing. The giants never left. They became the sea itself, and the story, as always, continues. Not toward an ending, but toward another transformation waiting quietly beneath the waves. The ocean holds more memory than any living thing. It does not remember in words or images, but in movement, in chemistry, in quiet persistence. Every tide is a continuation of all tides before it. Every current carries fragments of ancient life, dissolved into salt and time. When you stand by the shore and listen to the slow rhythm of waves, you're hearing not just water, but the unbroken voice of the planet itself. The sea remembers everything, because everything has passed through it. The atoms in every drop of seawater have been part of countless stories. Some once belonged to the vapour of volcanic skies, falling as the first rain when the earth was still cooling. Others flowed through rivers during the Devonian, carrying minerals to coral reefs where armoured fish drifted. Some were trapped in the ice of long winters, or in the bodies of creatures that no longer exist. When the great reptiles ruled, these same molecules moved through their gills and lungs. When the mammals returned, they breathed them again. The ocean has no gaps in its history. It is continuous. If you could see time layered beneath the surface, it would not appear as separate ages, but as a single shifting field of motion. The waves you see now are shaped by winds that owe their patterns to mountains raised by tectonic forces that once lay beneath the sea. The salt in the water is the residue of rock dissolved by ancient rains. The colour of the ocean, its deep blue, comes from light absorbed and scattered by the same chemical bonds that have existed since the beginning. Nothing in the sea is new, everything is rearranged. When light moves through water, it slows slightly, bending as it passes from air into liquid. It's a small change, almost invisible, but it makes the ocean both a mirror and a memory. Beneath its surface, light lingers longer, just as history does. The shapes of the past are softened but never erased. Fossils on the seabed are just the solid form of that persistence, outlines of creatures that lived, died, and were folded into the story of the planet. Each one is an entry in a record that the sea keeps without intention. The reefs that exist today are both ancient and new. They grow from the same families of coral that built the first ecosystems in the Cambrian, but they also adapt constantly to the present. The calcium they secrete once passed through the bodies of other organisms. The stone of the reef is a mosaic of lives layered together, each one brief, but together forming something that outlasts any single being. When a wave breaks over a reef, it's moving across the remains of uncounted generations, turned into rock so that new life can attach to it. Even the deep ocean, silent and cold, is alive with history. Sediment accumulates slowly, a few centimetres per 1,000 years, yet over millions it builds a record of everything that has ever fallen. Shells, bones, dust, spores, microscopic plankton. In those layers lie traces of every extinction and recovery, every chemical change in the air, every eruption, every bloom of life. If the earth had a diary, it would be written in that mud. The sea remembers in weight and pressure, in the slow layering of time. The modern ocean still carries echoes of the great ages. The migration of whales mirrors the journeys of ancient reptiles that once crossed entire seas in search of food. The skilling of fish reflects the survival strategies first learned in the Cambrian. Even the spiral of a shell repeats patterns seen in fossils billions of years old. Evolution may change the players, but it rarely alters the script. The ocean keeps using what works. It refines, but it never forgets. There's a kind of calm in realizing that the sea has seen it all before. Warming, cooling, rising, falling, abundance and collapse. It has endured impacts, volcanic winters and ice ages, yet it always rebuilds. Its chemistry adjusts, its currents shift, and life begins again. The ocean doesn't resist change, it incorporates it. Its memory is not nostalgia, but function. It remembers so it can continue. The creatures that swim today are part of that continuity. The whale that dives into darkness follows a path laid down by creatures that existed before land plants had leaves. The shark that moves through coral shadows carries a lineage unbroken since before trees took root. Even the smallest plankton floating at the surface is a descendant of cells that once transformed the atmosphere itself. The ocean doesn't divide the past from the present, it merges them. When you look at a wave, you're not seeing a thing, you're seeing motion, energy passing through matter. The water itself doesn't travel far, it moves in circles, rising and falling as the wave passes. The ocean's memory works the same way. Events pass through it, but the medium remains. Extinctions, rebirths, migrations, all ripple through time, carried forward but never truly gone. In that sense, the sea is the planet's mind. It processes, adjusts and responds. When the climate warms, it absorbs heat. When carbon rises, it pulls it from the air. When nutrients build up, it redistributes them through currents that take centuries to complete their loops. Every part of the ocean is in conversation with every other. The surface speaks to the deep through temperature. The deep responds through upwelling, and the cycle continues without pause. The memory isn't just in sediment or salt, it's in movement itself. There's a paradox in how the ocean holds both permanence and change at once. It is always moving, yet always the same. The waves that touch a shore today are not the same molecules that touched it yesterday, but the pattern, the rhythm endures. That rhythm is what connects every era, every form of life. It's what linked the armoured fish of the Devonian to the whales of today. The ocean keeps the tempo and everything else adapts to it. The sound of the ocean is the sound of that memory in motion. The low roar of waves, the hiss of foam, the crack of breaking surf. These are not random noises, but the audible evidence of energy exchanged between air and water, between present and past. Even the deep carries its own sound. The clicks of whales, the distant rumble of shifting currents, the faint crackle of coral reefs alive with small life. The planet hums beneath the surface, and every frequency carries history. Human beings have always been drawn to that sound. It speaks in a language older than words, steady enough to quiet thought. The first sailors who crossed open water heard it without understanding its scale. The first divers who looked below the surface saw only glimpses of what lay beneath. Yet every person who has ever looked at the horizon over the sea has felt the same thing. A sense that it contains everything that came before and everything still to come. That feeling is not imagination, it's recognition. The water in our bodies is the same that fills the ocean. The salt in our blood is the same ratio found in seawater. We carry its chemistry within us because we came from it. We are part of its memory. The sea remembers us too. Every piece of stone shaped by human hands that ends up in the tide, every bit of metal, glass or plastic, will one day settle into sediment and become part of the geological record. The ocean doesn't judge what it keeps. It doesn't separate the natural from the artificial. It will turn our creations into part of its story, just as it has done with every species before us. What we leave behind becomes part of its archive. The future ocean will remember this age, our ships, our noise, our warming, our presence. Its chemistry will carry the imprint of what we've done. Yet even as we alter it, the ocean continues to sustain us, just as it has sustained everything that ever lived. It absorbs heat, stores carbon, and regulates the climate. It feeds billions and shapes every breath of air. Its memory isn't passive, it is active, shaping the conditions that allow life to persist. When you think of the sea as a living system of memory, extinction no longer feels like an ending. It becomes a transformation written into a larger story. Every rise and fall of species, every flood and drought, every moment of balance and imbalance is part of that ongoing narrative. The sea doesn't forget the loss of its creatures, but it also doesn't stop creating new ones. Life is its form of remembrance. Even the smallest act of the sea, a wave breaking, a current turning, is part of that cycle. It's the mechanism by which history is translated into the present. The minerals carried by a river from eroding mountains become nutrients for plankton. The carbon from a decaying organism becomes the structure of another. The memory is not symbolic, it is chemical, physical, absolute. If you could slow time and watch the ocean story play out in one long motion, it would look like breathing, expansion and contraction, abundance and scarcity, creation and dissolution, each phase feeding the next, none lasting forever. The memory of each moment would remain in the next, not as a perfect replica, but as influence, a shape left behind in the flow. The sea doesn't need to speak for us to understand it. Its presence is its message. It reminds us that continuity is possible even through destruction, that persistence is not resistance but adaptation. It shows that to remember is not to hold still, but to carry forward. Every tide is proof of that, retreating, returning, repeating. If you stand at the edge of the water and watch a wave wash over your feet, you're standing in the same process that shaped continents and sculpted life. The ocean beneath you has seen the rise of oxygen, the creation of continents, the building of reefs, the fall of giants, and the birth of intelligence. It has erased mountains and preserved shells so small they can only be seen through glass. Its patience makes everything else seem brief, and yet despite its age it never loses its sense of movement. It continues to make new worlds from the remnants of the old, to breathe through its tides, to nurture whatever survives. Its memory is not weight, it is fuel. It holds everything not as burden, but as potential. The sea remembers everything, not because it clings to the past, but because it is the past, present and future in one unbroken motion. It is the archive and the author of Earth's story, the beginning and the continuation. Every creature that has lived, every sound that has travelled through its depths, every fragment of light that has entered its surface is still there in some form, transformed but enduring. When night falls and the surface turns black under the reflection of the sky, the stars above mirror the bioluminescent flashes below. The same laws of physics govern both: motion, gravity, energy, decay. The ocean is the universe made visible, a small part of the cosmos remembering itself through water. And as you listen to the slow rhythm of the waves, to the quiet hiss of the tide pulling back, you are hearing the oldest voice on the planet speaking not in words but in time. It has no beginning you can mark and no end you can predict. It will continue long after everything else has faded. It doesn't ask for attention or understanding. It only moves, holds and renews. The sea remembers everything, and in its memory it carries all of us.